You just kicked the wrong man, officer, and in about 30 seconds you're going to wish you'd stayed home today. The morning mist clung to the cracked asphalt outside Millbrook County Courthouse like a burial shroud, and Commander Devon Washington pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around shoulders that had once carried the weight of national security on foreign soil, but now bore only the invisible burden of 23 men who didn't make it home. He looked like what the world expected him to be in this moment. Another black man down on his luck, another casualty of a system that chewed up veterans and spit them out on street corners, another face that would blend into the background noise of American poverty. His truck, a rust-eaten Ford with Tennessee plates, sat in the courthouse parking lot next to the Maseratis and Audis of lawyers who made more in a month than Devon's entire military pension. But he wasn't here by choice, and he certainly wasn't here to make trouble. 3 days ago, he'd been sleeping in a Walmart parking lot when Officer Blake Morrison, a man whose platinum blonde hair seemed to glow with the kind of arrogance that came from never being told no, decided that a black man in a pickup truck was suspicious enough to warrant investigation harassment and eventually arrest for the crime of loitering with intent. Devon had learned a long time ago, first in the projects of Detroit and later in the mountains of Afghanistan, that survival often meant becoming invisible, letting people see what they expected to see rather than what was really there. So when Morrison strutted over with his hand resting on his gun like some cowboy from a bad movie, Devon had played the part perfectly. "Yes, sir. No, sir. Just passing through, sir. No trouble at all, sir." He'd watched Morrison's eyes rake over the military tattoos on his forearms, the faded Navy insignia on his jacket, the way he held himself with the kind of posture that 18 years of military discipline burned into a man's DNA. And he'd seen the exact moment when Morrison decided that this particular black man needed to be taught a lesson about knowing his place. The irony wasn't lost on Devon that he'd survived 3 tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, had killed men who deserved killing, and saved others who deserved saving only to find himself handcuffed in rural Tennessee for the crime of existing while black in a public space. But there was something else at work here. Something his years of intelligence gathering had taught him to recognize. Morrison wasn't just a racist with a badge, though he was certainly that he was part of something bigger, something more organized, something that turned prejudice into profit and made suffering into a cottage industry. As Devon walked up the courthouse steps, his worn boots clicking against marble that probably cost more than most people in this county, made in a year, he felt the familiar weight of the small recording device hidden in the lining of his jacket, a habit he'd developed during his years doing classified work in places where documentation meant the difference between justice and cover-up. He wasn't planning to use it, wasn't planning to make waves or draw attention to himself, but old habits died hard, and Devon Washington had learned that when you're a black man in America, you'd better have proof of everything that happens to you, because your word alone will never be enough. The courthouse lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant, and the kind of quiet desperation that accumulated in places where people's fates were decided by strangers in black robes. And as Devon took his place in the line of defendants waiting for their names to be called, he noticed the subtle ways the system sorted people into categories. The well-dressed white defendants with their expensive lawyers got called first, while the black and brown faces got pushed to the back, got assigned overworked public defenders who barely had time to learn their names, got processed through a machine designed to extract guilty pleas and move on to the next case. Devon had been trained to observe, to catalog details that other people missed, to see patterns in chaos and find weaknesses in what looked like strength. So he watched the bailiffs memorize the layout of the courtroom, noted the locations of the cameras and the blind spots where things could happen without being recorded. He wasn't planning trouble, but trouble had a way of finding men like him, men who didn't bow and scrape and shuffle their feet when authority demanded submission, and Devon Washington had learned long ago that the best way to survive trouble was to be ready for it before it arrived. Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom operated with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse processing defendants with the same cold precision used to turn living creatures into profitable cuts of meat. and she sat behind her bench like a pale queen surveying her domain with silver blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disdain. She'd been on the bench for 12 years, long enough to perfect the art of making constitutional violations look like routine procedure, long enough to build relationships with the private prison companies that paid her speaking fees and the bail bond businesses that kicked back percentages of their profits. Detective Sarah Collins sat in the back row of the courtroom, her mixed-race features allowing her to blend into backgrounds in ways that had served her well during 15 years of police work. But what really made her dangerous to people like Morrison and Hawthorne was her habit of paying attention to details that other cops ignored, her tendency to ask questions that other officers avoided, and her complete inability to look the other way when she saw injustice disguised as law enforcement. She'd been watching Morrison for months, documenting his pattern of targeting black men for arrests that never quite held up in court, but generated enough revenue to keep the county's budget afloat and the private contractors happy. Court reporter James Mitchell had started this job fresh out of college with idealistic notions about justice and truth, but 6 months of transcribing Judge Hawthorne's proceedings had shown him how easily words could be twisted, how testimony could be selectively recorded, and how the official record could be sanitized to hide the ugly reality of what happened in this courtroom every day. He sat behind his stenography machine like a monk copying scripture, except the scripture he was copying was often a lie, and every day he had to decide whether to preserve the truth or protect his paycheck. The morning docket was the usual parade of poverty and prejudice. Black men arrested for driving while black Hispanic women charged with working, while undocumented white defendants with obvious drug problems who somehow got sent to treatment programs, while minorities with the same issues got sent to jail. Morrison stood at the prosecutor's table like he owned the place, which in many ways he did, his platinum blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights as he adjusted his tie and prepared to deliver another performance designed to convince 12 citizens that his version of events was the only one that mattered. Devon Washington's name was called 14th, after all the white defendants had been processed, and most of the gallery had emptied out a timing that wasn't accidental, because Judge Hawthorne preferred to handle her more questionable cases when fewer witnesses were around to see how justice was really administered in Millbrook County. Devon stood when his name was called, his posture automatically straightening into the military bearing that 18 years of service had burned into his nervous system, a habit so ingrained that even 3 months of living rough hadn't been able to break it. The charges were read in the monotone voice that court clerks use to make even the most serious accusations sound routine. Loitering with intent, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. But Devon noticed the small details that revealed the larger pattern. The way Morrison's report contained phrases that appeared word for word in other cases. The way the alleged timeline didn't match the documented facts. The way Judge Hawthorne's questions seemed designed to generate specific answers rather than uncover the truth. Morrison had perfected his performance over 3 years of practice, learning exactly which words triggered which responses from judges and juries, knowing how to present himself as the reasonable professional dealing with an unreasonable suspect, understanding that his word would always carry more weight than any defense a black defendant could offer. He stood with his shoulders squared and his voice pitched to sound both authoritative and slightly wounded, like a man who was simply trying to do his job despite being forced to deal with people who refused to cooperate with legitimate law enforcement. Sarah Collins had her phone positioned so she could record without being obvious about it, a technique she'd learned during her years working domestic violence cases, where official reports rarely told the whole story, and she watched Morrison's body language for the tells that indicated when he was about to embellish or outright fabricate details. She'd seen him do this dance before, had watched him transform routine encounters into dramatic confrontations through careful word choice and strategic omissions. But something about this case felt different. Something about the way the defendant was watching Morrison suggested that this particular black man wasn't going to play the role everyone expected him to play. James Mitchell positioned his fingers over the stenography keys and prepared to record another version of Morrison's standard story. But he found himself watching the defendant's face instead of listening to the officer's words, noting the way the man's eyes moved around the courtroom like he was cataloging details, the way he held himself with a kind of stillness that reminded James of documentaries he'd seen about soldiers and their 1,000-yard stare. There was something about this defendant that didn't fit the usual pattern, something that made James pay closer attention to every word that was about to be spoken. Judge Hawthorne looked down at Devon Washington with the same expression she reserved for all the black defendants who appeared before her bench, a mixture of boredom and barely concealed contempt that suggested she'd already decided his guilt before hearing a word of evidence, and she prepared to deliver the same speech she'd given hundreds of times before about the importance of respecting law enforcement and accepting responsibility for one's actions. But as she met Devon's eyes, something flickered across her face, a momentary uncertainty that suggested she recognized something in his expression that she hadn't expected to see. "Mr. Washington, you are appearing before this court without representation, which means you'll be defending yourself against charges that could result in significant jail time and substantial fines," Judge Hawthorne announced with the tone of someone reading a grocery list. But Devon noticed the way her eyes kept flicking toward Morrison, the subtle nods and gestures that suggested they'd choreographed this dance many times before. "Do you understand the charges against you? And do you wish to enter a plea at this time?" Devon stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled in a way that made Sarah Collins lean forward in her seat, because she recognized the body language of someone who'd been trained to stay calm under pressure, someone who understood that the wrong gesture at the wrong moment could escalate a situation beyond anyone's ability to control it. "Your Honor, I understand the charges as they've been read, but I'd like to hear Officer Morrison's account of the events before I respond, because I want to make sure we're all talking about the same incident." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction that might have been missed by most observers, but that Devon cataloged automatically along with the officer's increased breathing rate, the slight shift in his stance, and the way his hand moved closer to his belt, all indicators that the man was preparing for some kind of confrontation. "Your Honor." The defendant was observed loitering in the parking lot of a 24-hour retail establishment at approximately 0200 hours, and when I approached to investigate, he became belligerent and refused to comply with lawful orders to provide identification. The words rolled off Morrison's tongue with practiced ease, but Devon heard the inconsistencies immediately. The timestamp that didn't match the receipt in his wallet from the gas station where he'd bought coffee at 1:47 a.m., the claim about refusing to provide identification when he'd actually handed over his military ID without being asked the description of belligerent behavior when he'd remained seated in his truck with his hands visible on the steering wheel throughout the entire encounter. But more than the factual inaccuracies, Devon recognized the template Morrison was using, the same basic structure that bullying cops had been using for decades to transform their victims into perpetrators. "Officer Morrison, can you be more specific about what you mean by belligerent behavior?" Judge Hawthorne asked. But her tone suggested she was lobbing him a softball rather than conducting any kind of serious examination, and Devon realized that this entire proceeding was theater, a performance designed to rubber stamp a predetermined outcome while going through the motions of due process. Morrison's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of an actor who'd been given his favorite scene to perform, and he turned toward the gallery as if addressing a jury, even though this was just a preliminary hearing. "Your Honor, when I approached the defendant's vehicle, he immediately began questioning my authority, asking why he was being stopped and demanding to know what crime he was suspected of committing, which in my experience is typical behavior for individuals who are attempting to conceal criminal activity." Sarah Collins felt her teeth clench as she listened to Morrison transform Devon's completely reasonable questions into evidence of guilt, a technique she'd seen him use dozens of times to justify arrests that had no legal basis. But what really caught her attention was the way Devon was listening with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was recording every word for future reference. She pulled out her phone and started recording not just the audio but the video as well, because something about this case felt like it was going to matter more than the usual parade of manufactured charges and predetermined outcomes. Mr. Washington, how do you respond to Officer Morrison's account of your behavior during this encounter? Judge Hawthorne asked, and Devon could hear the expectation in her voice, the assumption that he would either deny everything uselessly or accept responsibility and beg for mercy, because those were the only two options that defendants like him were supposed to have in courtrooms like this one. Devon took a breath and spoke in the calm, clear voice that had briefed generals and addressed congressional committees, a voice that carried authority even when its owner was dressed like a vagrant. Your Honor, I was parked legally in a public parking lot drinking coffee that I had purchased from the attached convenience store when Officer Morrison approached my vehicle without probable cause or reasonable suspicion of any criminal activity. When he asked for identification, I immediately provided my military identification card along with my driver's license, and when he asked about my activities, I explained that I was traveling through the area and had stopped to rest, which is completely legal. Morrison's face was beginning to flush with the kind of anger that came from having his narrative challenged, especially by someone who was supposed to be powerless, someone who was supposed to accept whatever version of events law enforcement decided to provide. Your Honor, the defendant is mischaracterizing the encounter in an attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions, which included refusing to exit the vehicle when ordered and making threatening gestures that caused me to fear for my safety. The lie was so blatant that Sarah Collins actually gasped audibly because she'd seen Morrison's body cam footage from similar arrests and knew that his definition of threatening gestures usually meant things like maintaining eye contact or asking questions about constitutional rights. But what really surprised her was Devon's reaction, or rather his complete lack of reaction. He didn't get angry or indignant or defensive like most defendants would when faced with obvious perjury. He just continued watching Morrison with the kind of clinical interest that a scientist might show when observing a particularly fascinating specimen. Officer Morrison, are you alleging that Mr. Washington threatened you physically during this encounter? Judge Hawthorne asked, and Morrison could hear the opportunity in her question. The invitation to escalate his story to whatever level was necessary to justify the charges and the arrest. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he looked at Devon, taking in the man's military bearing. His obvious physical fitness, despite his rough appearance, the way he held himself with the confidence of someone who'd been in actual combat, rather than the manufactured conflicts that small-town cops use to justify their aggression. Your Honor, the defendant has obvious military training and displayed the kind of tactical awareness that suggested he was evaluating me as a potential threat, which in my experience indicates someone who's prepared to use violence against law enforcement. Devon felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what Morrison was doing. The officer was building a case for lethal force, creating a narrative that would justify whatever happened next, laying the groundwork for a story that would explain why a homeless veteran ended up dead in a holding cell or during an escape attempt. He'd seen this pattern before in places where American soldiers were the occupying force and local populations were the enemy, but he'd never expected to see it deployed against American citizens in American courtrooms. Mr. Washington, do you have any military experience that might explain Officer Morrison's concerns about your behavior? Judge Hawthorne asked, and Devon realized that she was giving Morrison exactly the opening he needed to complete his transformation from aggressor to victim. Devon looked directly at Judge Hawthorne and spoke with the kind of quiet dignity that made Sarah Collins grip her phone tighter, because she could sense the electricity building in the room, the tension that always preceded violence in places where power was absolute and accountability was optional. Your Honor, I served 18 years in the United States Navy, including multiple combat deployments, and I was trained to de-escalate situations rather than create them, which is why I remained calm and cooperative throughout my entire interaction with Officer Morrison, despite his obvious hostility. Morrison's face went from flushed to purple as he heard his authority being questioned by someone who was supposed to be beneath him in the social hierarchy, someone who was supposed to grovel and apologize and accept whatever punishment the system decided to dispense. And Sarah Collins recognized the signs of a man whose ego had just been publicly punctured by someone he considered inferior. Your Honor, I think the defendant's military background actually supports my assessment that he represents a potential threat to public safety, especially given his current circumstances as an unemployed vagrant with obvious psychological issues. The insult hung in the air like poison gas, and James Mitchell's fingers hesitated over his stenography keys because he knew he was witnessing something that would matter, something that would be analyzed and dissected and argued over in appeals courts and civil rights lawsuits, assuming anyone survived to file them. He watched Devon's face for any sign of the anger that Morrison was obviously trying to provoke, but instead he saw something much more dangerous, the kind of cold calculation that suggested a man who was used to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Officer Morrison, I think you're allowing your personal feelings to cloud your professional judgment, Devon said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding men in combat, from making decisions that affected national security, from living with consequences that small-town bullies couldn't begin to imagine. I haven't threatened you, I haven't resisted arrest, and I haven't done anything except exist in a public space while being black, which apparently is still a crime in your jurisdiction. The silence that followed Devon's words was the kind that preceded explosions, and Sarah Collins held her breath as she watched Morrison's entire body coil like a spring under maximum tension, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon as his face contorted with the kind of rage that came from being called out by someone who was supposed to be powerless. Judge Hawthorne was also watching Morrison with growing concern, not because she cared about justice or constitutional rights, but because she recognized the signs of a man who was about to do something that would be impossible to cover up or explain away. You want to run your mouth about what's a crime and what isn't, Morrison snarled, stepping around the prosecutor's table with the deliberate movement of a predator who'd finally decided to drop the pretense of civilization, his voice rising to a volume that made the bailiff shift nervously in his chair. You want to sit there in your filthy clothes and lecture me about law enforcement when you're nothing but a walking failure who couldn't even hold down a job in the real world? Devon remained perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unchanged. But Sarah Collins could see the subtle shift in his posture that suggested every muscle in his body was coiled and ready to respond to whatever happened next. She'd interviewed enough combat veterans to recognize the signs of someone who'd been trained to absorb punishment and wait for the perfect moment to strike back someone who understood that patience was often the difference between victory and defeat. Mr. Morrison, I suggest you return to your position and allow the court to proceed with this hearing, Judge Hawthorne said. But her voice lacked conviction because she could see that her pet attack dog had slipped his leash and was operating on instinct rather than instruction rage, rather than calculation. Morrison ignored the judge completely and continued walking toward Devon with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who wanted to savor every moment of what was about to happen, his right hand already clenching into a fist as he spoke in a voice that carried all the accumulated hatred of a lifetime spent believing that his skin color made him superior to men like the one sitting calmly in the defendant's chair. You think because you put on a uniform and played soldier that makes you special. You think that gives you the right to disrespect a real American who's trying to protect his community from people like you. Sarah Collins watched in horror as Morrison approached Devon with obvious violent intent. But what terrified her even more was the complete lack of intervention from anyone else in the courtroom. The bailiff was frozen in place. Judge Hawthorne was watching like this was entertainment rather than assault, and James Mitchell was staring at his keyboard like he was hoping it would all disappear if he didn't look up. She realized that she was witnessing something that happened regularly in this courtroom, something that had been covered up and explained away so many times that everyone involved had stopped pretending it was unusual. Officer Morrison, You need to step back and control yourself before you do something that will end your career and possibly land you in federal prison," Devon said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made Morrison pause for just a moment, long enough for Sarah Collins to get a clear shot of what happened next with her phone camera. Morrison's kick was delivered with all the force and hatred he could muster, aimed directly at Devon's ribs with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't his first time using violence to put uppity minorities in their place. But what Morrison didn't know was that he'd just committed assault against someone whose reflexes had been honed by years of combat in places where a moment's hesitation meant death. Devon's response was instantaneous and devastating. He caught Morrison's leg in mid-kick, used the officer's own momentum against him, and sent him crashing to the floor with a technique that was so smooth and efficient that it looked almost effortless. The sound of Morrison's body hitting the marble floor echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, followed by the kind of silence that accompanies moments when everything changes irrevocably, when the careful balance of power that allows systems to function suddenly shifts and leaves everyone scrambling to figure out what comes next. Morrison lay stunned and gasping, his face a mask of shock and rage and something that might have been fear, while Devon remained seated calmly with his hands folded, looking like nothing more dramatic had happened than someone dropping a book. "Bailiff, arrest that man immediately," Judge Hawthorne screamed, her voice cracking with panic as she realized that her carefully controlled courtroom had just become a crime scene, that her pet attack dog had just been neutralized by someone who was supposed to be a victim, that everything she'd worked to build and maintain was about to come crashing down around her. The emergency meeting in Judge Hawthorne's chambers had the frantic energy of a crisis management session at a failing corporation, with Sheriff Tom Bradley pacing behind the desk like a caged animal, while Morrison held an ice pack to his bruised face, and Judge Hawthorne frantically shuffled through law books, looking for precedents that might help them explain away what had just happened in open court. The three of them had been operating their little kingdom of corruption for over 5 years, splitting the profits from their manufactured crime wave and basking in the praise of a community that believed their tough-on-crime rhetoric was making the streets safer. "We stick to the story that he attacked you unprovoked," Sheriff Bradley announced with the kind of authoritative confidence that came from decades of making problems disappear, his white mustache bristling as he spoke. "Self-defense doesn't apply when you're assaulting a police officer in a courtroom, and any jury in this county will take our word over some homeless veteran's version of events." Morrison's ego was still smarting from being humiliated by someone he'd considered an easy target, but his survival instincts were finally beginning to override his pride as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. "The problem is that little mixed-race detective was filming everything with her phone, and God knows who else in that courtroom had their cameras running when it happened. We can't control the narrative if there's video evidence showing exactly what really took place." Judge Hawthorne looked up from her law books with the wild-eyed expression of someone who'd just realized that her entire world was about to collapse around her, because she understood better than the other two men exactly how much scrutiny this case was going to generate if it made its way into the wrong hands. "We need to confiscate all electronic devices from everyone who was in that courtroom, claim their evidence in an ongoing investigation, and make sure that any recordings disappear into our evidence locker where they can have an unfortunate accident." Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the courthouse holding cells, Devon Washington sat in lotus position on the concrete bench, his breathing controlled and his mind clear as he processed what had just occurred and began calculating his next moves with the same methodical precision he'd used to plan military operations. The cell was designed to be intimidating and demoralizing with its windowless walls and buzzing fluorescent light, but Devon had been held in much worse places by much more dangerous people, and he found the isolation almost peaceful after the chaos of the courtroom. He knew that Morrison's assault had been recorded by multiple witnesses, including Detective Collins, whose positioning and behavior had identified her as someone who was documenting rather than simply observing the proceedings. He also knew that his defensive response, while completely justified under any reasonable interpretation of self-defense law, would be twisted into evidence of his violent nature by prosecutors who needed to maintain their conviction rates and their relationships with law enforcement. But what troubled Devon most wasn't the legal jeopardy he now faced, but the realization that Morrison's behavior represented something much larger and more dangerous than simple individual prejudice. This was institutional racism operating as a business model, a carefully constructed system designed to criminalize poverty and extract profit from human misery. He'd seen similar operations in war zones where corrupt officials used their authority to prey on vulnerable populations, and he knew that exposing the corruption would require more than just proving his innocence in this particular case. Detective Sarah Collins was moving with the focused urgency of someone who understood that she had a small window of opportunity before the cover-up machine kicked into full gear, and she drove through the winding Tennessee back roads toward the state capitol, with her phone connected to a secure upload service that would ensure Devon's story reached federal authorities regardless of what happened to her locally. She'd been building a case against Morrison and his network for months, documenting their pattern of targeting minority defendants and generating revenue through manufactured charges, but she'd never had evidence as dramatic and conclusive as the footage she'd just captured. Her phone was already ringing with calls from Sheriff Bradley's office, undoubtedly demanding that she surrender her device as evidence in their investigation. But Sarah had learned long ago that in cases involving police corruption, the local authorities were usually part of the problem rather than part of the solution. She'd seen too many cases where crucial evidence mysteriously disappeared from police custody. Too many witnesses who suddenly changed their stories after visits from helpful detectives. Too many prosecutors who decided that pursuing charges against law enforcement wasn't in the public interest. Sheriff Bradley was working his phone like a man possessed, calling in favors from prosecutors and judges throughout the region, trying to build a firewall around his operation before the story could spread beyond his ability to control it. He'd spent 30 years building relationships with the kind of people who understood that law enforcement was a business like any other, with profits to protect and market share to defend. And he knew exactly which buttons to push to ensure cooperation from officials who had their own interests to protect. "I've got Judge Morrison in the 3rd District willing to issue a gag order on all participants pending a full investigation," he announced to his co-conspirators, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just executed a successful damage control maneuver. "And District Attorney Phillips owes me enough favors that he'll make sure any federal prosecutors who come sniffing around get redirected to more pressing matters elsewhere in the state." But even as Sheriff Bradley worked his network of corrupt contacts, he could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet in ways that made his decades of experience feel inadequate to the challenge they now faced. This wasn't just another case of a minority defendant crying brutality that could be dismissed with character assassination and procedural delays. This was a situation that involved multiple witnesses' video evidence and, most importantly, a defendant who clearly understood the legal system well enough to navigate it effectively. Judge Hawthorne was frantically deleting emails and shredding documents with the desperate energy of someone who knew that federal investigators would soon be crawling through every aspect of her judicial record, looking for patterns of bias and corruption that she'd been careful to hide, but never careful enough to eliminate completely. Her financial relationships with private prison companies and bail bond services had always been structured to maintain plausible deniability. But she understood that scrutiny of the kind this case would generate could expose connections that had seemed safe when hidden in plain sight. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that their attempt to process another routine victim had instead ensnared them with someone who possessed both the knowledge and the evidence necessary to bring down their entire operation. But they were committed now to a path that would either end with Devon Washington's complete destruction or their own exposure and prosecution. The machine they'd built to crush the powerless had encountered someone who refused to be crushed, and the collision was going to destroy one side or the other. Admiral Jennifer Cole was reviewing intelligence briefings in her Pentagon office when the secure communications system began flashing with the kind of priority alerts that meant one of her assets was in immediate danger. And as she read through the automated reports detailing Commander Devon Washington's missed check-in, she felt the familiar cold anger that came with realizing that one of her most valuable operators was being threatened by people who had no idea what they were dealing with. Admiral Cole had been managing special operations personnel for 15 years, long enough to know that when decorated combat veterans went silent during routine domestic travel, it usually meant they'd encountered the kind of trouble that required immediate federal intervention. Devon Washington wasn't just another Navy SEAL on her roster. He was a man whose classified service record included operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, eliminated high-value targets, and gathered intelligence that had shaped American foreign policy in ways that would never be acknowledged publicly. He was also a man whose psychological profile indicated someone struggling with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, someone who might put himself in dangerous situations as a form of penance for being alive when so many of his brothers in arms were not. The preliminary report from her intelligence team painted a disturbing picture of rural law enforcement corruption in Millbrook County, Tennessee, with patterns of misconduct that suggested a coordinated effort to criminalize poverty and extract profit from human misery. But what really caught Admiral Cole's attention was the description of Devon's arrest and the circumstances that led to his current detention, because she recognized the hallmarks of institutional racism operating under color of law, the same kind of oppression that American forces were supposedly fighting against in foreign countries. "Get me Special Agent Torres from the FBI's Civil Rights Division," she ordered her aide, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding operations where failure meant American casualties and diplomatic disasters. "And contact the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. I want federal marshals prepared to move within the hour if necessary. Nobody holds one of my people without proper justification, especially when that justification appears to be manufactured by corrupt local officials." Within minutes, Admiral Cole was connected to Special Agent Rachel Torres, whose reputation for prosecuting police misconduct cases had made her both feared by corrupt law enforcement and respected by civil rights organizations throughout the country. Torres had been tracking patterns of abuse in rural jurisdictions for 3 years, documenting how isolated communities often became laboratories for the kind of oppression that wouldn't be tolerated in urban areas with more oversight and media attention. "Admiral, I've been looking at Millbrook County for months based on complaints from civil rights groups, but we've never had enough evidence to justify federal intervention." Torres explained, her voice tight with frustration. "If your man was assaulted in open court by a police officer, and if there's video evidence of the incident, then we finally have the probable cause we need to launch a full investigation into their entire operation." Admiral Cole pulled up Devon's complete service record on her secure terminal, scrolling through 18 years of commendations, combat deployments, and classified operations that had served American interests in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. "Agent Torres, Commander Washington, has clearance levels that I can't discuss over this connection, but I can tell you that he's been trained to handle situations that would break most people, and if he's being held by corrupt local officials, then we need to extract him before they realize exactly who they're dealing with." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language that federal officials used when discussing operations that skirted the edges of domestic jurisdiction, but the message was clear. The United States military was preparing to retrieve one of its most valuable assets from what appeared to be an illegal detention by corrupt local authorities. Torres understood that cases like this represented rare opportunities to expose rural law enforcement corruption that usually operated beyond federal oversight protected by isolation, and the assumption that minority victims wouldn't have the resources or connections to fight back effectively. "I'm authorizing an immediate deployment of federal marshals to secure Commander Washington and any evidence related to his arrest." Admiral Cole announced, her tone carrying the finality of someone who'd made similar decisions in war zones where American lives hung in the balance. "And I want a complete investigation of everyone involved in this case from the arresting officer up through the judicial chain. Because what happened to my man today probably happened to dozens of others who didn't have federal protection." Dr. Michael Freeman was driving through downtown Nashville when his secure phone rang with a call from Admiral Cole's office, and as he listened to the description of Devon Washington's situation, he felt the familiar combination of professional concern and personal anger that came with treating veterans who'd served their country honorably only to be victimized by the society they'd sworn to protect. Dr. Freeman had been treating combat veterans for 12 years, long enough to understand how military training could become a liability in civilian situations where de-escalation and compliance were expected, rather than tactical assessment and decisive action. Admiral Commander Washington has been dealing with severe survivor's guilt related to the ambush that killed his entire team 3 years ago. Dr. Freeman explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that military psychiatrists used when discussing classified operations. He's been isolating himself as a form of self-punishment, living rough and avoiding contact with family and friends because he believes he doesn't deserve the life his teammates were denied. The psychological profile that Dr. Freeman painted explained both Devon's vulnerability to the kind of harassment that had led to his arrest and his restraint in responding to Morrison's assault. He was a man trained to use overwhelming force against enemies, but also a man whose guilt made him reluctant to defend himself against what he perceived as justified punishment for his survival. Admiral Cole understood that Devon's mental state made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable than typical detention subjects because his training would allow him to escape or resist in ways that local authorities couldn't handle, but his psychological condition might prevent him from taking the actions necessary to protect himself. Doctor, I need you in Tennessee within 4 hours to conduct a psychological evaluation of Commander Washington and to provide expert testimony about his mental state. If this case goes to trial, Admiral Cole ordered, already mobilizing the resources necessary to ensure that one of her most valuable assets received the protection and support he deserved. And I want a complete assessment of his fitness for duty, because if he's been living on the streets for 3 months without seeking help, then we've failed him as badly as the local authorities who arrested him. The federal response was being coordinated with the efficiency of a military operation, because Admiral Cole understood that Devon Washington's case represented more than just individual injustice. It was an opportunity to expose the kind of corruption that undermined American values and threatened the social contract between citizens and their government. The machine that had been built to crush the powerless was about to encounter the full weight of federal authority, and the collision was going to reshape law enforcement practices throughout the region. FBI Special Agent Rachel Torres arrived in Millbrook County with the kind of federal authority that made local officials nervous and corrupt. One's terrified her unmarked sedan, followed by 2 additional vehicles carrying the technical specialists and forensic accountants who would be necessary to untangle 5 years of carefully concealed corruption. She'd spent the flight from Washington reviewing the preliminary intelligence that Admiral Cole's team had gathered, and what she'd found was a textbook example of how institutional racism could be monetized through the criminal justice system, with minority arrests generating revenue streams that flowed from defendants to bondsmen to private contractors and back to the officials who made the system work. The Millbrook County Courthouse looked like a postcard from small-town America, all brick and marble and flagpoles. But Torres had learned long ago that the most dangerous corruption often hid behind facades of respectability and patriotism, protected by the assumption that federal authorities wouldn't waste time investigating rural jurisdictions that generated relatively few complaints. But Devon Washington's case had changed that calculus, because assaulting a decorated military officer in open court represented the kind of federal crime that demanded response, regardless of the jurisdiction's size or political connections. Detective Sarah Collins was waiting in the parking lot when Torres arrived, her service weapon clearly visible and her body language suggesting someone who'd been expecting trouble and was prepared to deal with it decisively if necessary. The 2 women recognized each other immediately as professionals who understood that police corruption was a cancer that destroyed communities from within, turning law enforcement from a protective force into a predatory one that preyed on the very people it was supposed to serve. Agent Torres. I've been documenting Morrison's pattern of abuse for 8 months, but this is the first time I've had video evidence that couldn't be suppressed or explained away. Sarah explained as she handed over a secure tablet containing not just the courtroom footage, but dozens of other incidents she'd recorded during her investigation. He targets black men almost exclusively, always finds reasons to escalate routine encounters into arrests, and consistently lies in his reports to justify the use of force. Torres scrolled through the evidence with the practiced eye of someone who'd prosecuted dozens of similar cases, noting the patterns that indicated coordinated misconduct rather than individual bad behavior. The similar language in police reports, the consistent judicial responses, the financial relationships that created incentives for maximum arrests and convictions. What she was seeing represented a conspiracy that extended far beyond Officer Morrison's individual prejudice, encompassing judges, prosecutors, bondsmen, and private contractors who'd created a profitable ecosystem based on criminalizing poverty and race. Detective Collins. This evidence suggests that Morrison was operating with institutional support rather than individual initiative. Torres observed her voice carrying the cold anger of someone who'd dedicated her career to fighting exactly this kind of corruption. The question is how deep the conspiracy goes, and how many people are going to prison when we finish untangling all the financial relationships that made this possible. Court reporter James Mitchell had spent the weekend wrestling with his conscience, knowing that his stenographic record of the courtroom incident would be crucial evidence in whatever federal investigation followed, but also understanding that telling the truth would end his career in Millbrook County and possibly expose him to retaliation from people who'd built their livelihoods on maintaining the official fiction. He'd become a court reporter because he believed in the importance of accurate documentation, but 6 months of working for Judge Hawthorne had shown him how easily truth could be manipulated by people who controlled the official record. When Agent Torres knocked on his apartment door Sunday evening, James was ready with flash drives containing not just the official transcript of Devon Washington's hearing, but also audio recordings of dozens of other cases where he'd documented judicial misconduct that never made its way into the official record. He'd been secretly recording proceedings since his 3rd week on the job, initially as protection against accusations that he'd made transcription errors, but increasingly as documentation of a system that routinely violated defendants' constitutional rights. Agent Torres Judge Hawthorne ordered me to alter the official record of Friday's incident to make it appear that the defendant initiated the assault rather than responding to Officer Morrison's attack. James explained, his voice shaking with a combination of fear and relief as he finally spoke the truth he'd been carrying for months. She's done this before dozens of times, changing testimony and deleting exchanges that might create grounds for appeal or federal review. The evidence that James provided was devastating in its scope and detail, showing a pattern of judicial misconduct that stretched back years and involved hundreds of cases where defendants' rights had been systematically violated in service of maintaining conviction rates and generating revenue for the county's various contractors and service providers. Torres understood that she was looking at the foundation for a federal civil rights lawsuit that could reshape law enforcement practices throughout the region and potentially send dozens of officials to federal prison. Dr. Michael Freeman's psychological evaluation of Devon Washington took place in a secure conference room at the federal building in Nashville, with Admiral Cole participating by secure video link and Torres observing to ensure that the assessment would be admissible in any future legal proceedings. Devon sat across from the psychiatrist who'd been treating his PTSD for 2 years, looking more composed than he had during their previous sessions, but also more emotionally detached, as if the trauma of his arrest had triggered defensive mechanisms that were protecting him from further psychological damage. Commander, your response to Officer Morrison's assault was textbook defensive tactics, but your decision to remain calm and compliant afterward suggests someone who's been trained to think strategically even under extreme stress. Dr. Freeman observed, his voice carrying the professional neutrality that allowed his patients to speak freely about traumatic experiences. Can you tell me what was going through your mind during those moments when Morrison was approaching you with obvious violent intent? Devon's response revealed both his military training and his psychological vulnerability as he described the automatic threat assessment that had allowed him to neutralize Morrison's attack, while simultaneously recognizing that any escalation would play into the narrative that portrayed him as dangerous rather than defensive. Doctor, I knew that Morrison wanted me to fight back, wanted me to give him justification for using lethal force, so I did exactly what was necessary to stop his attack, and nothing more." Devon explained, his voice steady, but his eyes showing the strain of someone who'd been forced to make life-or-death calculations in what should have been a routine legal proceeding. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Freeman's evaluation painted a picture of a decorated combat veteran whose survivor's guilt had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of abuse he'd encountered in Millbrook County, but who retained both the tactical skills and the moral framework necessary to respond appropriately when threatened with violence. Torres understood that Devon's case represented perfect evidence of how rural law enforcement could prey on vulnerable populations, knowing that their victims would either lack the resources to fight back, or, in Devon's case, the psychological willingness to defend themselves aggressively. Admiral Cole's participation in the evaluation was limited by security considerations, but her questions revealed both personal concern for Devon's welfare and professional anger at seeing one of her most valuable assets victimized by the kind of corruption that American military forces were fighting against in foreign countries. Commander Washington has served this nation with distinction in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and the idea that he can't travel safely through rural Tennessee without being assaulted by corrupt law enforcement represents a failure of our domestic institutions that demands immediate correction. She announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made similar determinations in war zones where American interests were at stake. The federal investigation was expanding rapidly as Torres's team uncovered financial relationships and communication patterns that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. But she understood that prosecuting institutional corruption required more than just proving individual crimes. It required dismantling the entire network of relationships that made the corruption profitable and sustainable. Sarah Collins had spent 3 sleepless nights compiling the complete evidence package that would serve as the foundation for federal prosecution of the entire Millbrook County corruption network. And as she spread the documents across the conference table in Agent Torres's temporary command center, she felt both satisfaction and exhaustion at finally being able to tell the whole truth about what she'd been witnessing for nearly a year. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. 47 false arrests over 3 years, all following the same pattern of targeting black men for manufactured charges that generated revenue streams flowing from defendants through bondsmen and contractors and back to the officials who made the system work. Agent Torres Morrison wasn't just a racist cop with a badge. He was the collection agent for an entire criminal enterprise that used law enforcement authority to extract money from minority communities, Sarah explained, pointing to financial records that showed how arrest quotas corresponded directly to budget cycles and contractor payments. Judge Hawthorne approved sentencing guidelines that maximized fines and fees. Sheriff Bradley coordinated with private prison companies to ensure steady occupancy rates, and the whole system was designed to criminalize poverty while generating profit for everyone except the people being victimized. The pattern that emerged from Sarah's investigation revealed how rural jurisdictions could become laboratories for the kind of oppression that would generate immediate federal intervention if it occurred in urban areas with better media coverage and civil rights oversight. Millbrook County had been selected precisely because of its isolation and demographic composition, with a large enough minority population to generate arrest revenue, but insufficient political power to challenge the system through normal democratic processes. Agent Torres studied the evidence with the focused intensity of someone who'd built her career on prosecuting exactly these kinds of cases, noting how the conspiracy had evolved over time from opportunistic individual corruption into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with multiple revenue streams and built-in protection mechanisms. Detective Collins. What we're looking at here represents a violation of federal civil rights law on a scale that demands prosecution under the RICO statutes, because this wasn't just police misconduct, it was organized crime operating under color of law. The financial analysis that Torres's forensic accountants had conducted showed money flows that would have made organized crime families proud, with arrest revenue being laundered through county contracts, consulting fees, and speaking engagements that disguised profit-sharing arrangements between public officials and private contractors. Judge Hawthorne alone had received over $200,000 in judicial education payments from companies that provided services to defendants in her courtroom, while Sheriff Bradley's department had purchased equipment from vendors who paid substantial commissions to county purchasing agents. Devon Washington's arrest had been intended as routine processing of another vulnerable victim, but instead it had exposed the entire network to federal scrutiny, because he possessed both the knowledge and the connections necessary to ensure that his case received the attention that previous victims had been denied. The irony wasn't lost on Torres that the conspiracy's attempt to victimize a decorated military officer had instead provided federal prosecutors with the evidence they needed to dismantle the entire operation. The investigation had also revealed that Devon's presence in Millbrook County hadn't been entirely coincidental. His classified work had included investigating human trafficking networks that used rural jurisdictions as staging areas, and his personal decision to travel through Tennessee had intersected with professional intelligence about criminal enterprises operating along interstate corridors. While his arrest had been based on Morrison's racial prejudice rather than any suspicion about his real identity, the convergence had created a perfect storm that would destroy the corruption network while advancing federal investigations into much larger criminal enterprises. Dr. Freeman's psychological evaluation had provided crucial context for understanding why Devon had responded to Morrison's assault with such precision and restraint, showing how his military training and survivor's guilt had combined to create someone who was simultaneously capable of devastating violence and reluctant to use it in defense of himself. Agent Torres Commander Washington's response to Morrison's attack was perfectly calibrated to neutralize the immediate threat, without escalating to a level that would justify lethal retaliation. Dr. Freeman explained his professional assessment, providing the foundation for any legal argument about self-defense. The broader implications of Devon's case extended far beyond individual justice to questions about how American veterans were being treated by the civilian institutions they'd sworn to protect, and Admiral Cole's involvement had ensured that the military's perspective would be represented in any prosecutorial decisions about how to proceed. The Pentagon's interest in the case wasn't just about protecting one decorated officer, but about sending a message that military personnel wouldn't be victimized by corrupt local authorities without facing federal consequences. Morrison's background investigation had revealed a pattern of escalating misconduct that should have disqualified him from law enforcement years earlier, including domestic violence incidents that had been covered up by departmental leadership and financial irregularities that suggested he'd been skimming money from evidence seizures. His platinum blonde hair and aggressive demeanor had made him the perfect face for a tough-on-crime campaign, but the reality was that he'd been operating as a criminal with a badge, using his authority to prey on vulnerable populations while generating revenue for his co-conspirators. Judge Hawthorne's judicial record showed a pattern of bias so blatant that it would have triggered automatic review if anyone had been systematically analyzing her decisions. But rural jurisdictions often operated with minimal oversight, precisely because they processed cases that affected people without the resources or connections to challenge obviously unfair treatment. Her financial relationships with private contractors had created conflicts of interest that violated every ethical standard for judicial conduct. But the isolation of her jurisdiction had allowed her to operate without scrutiny until Devon's case brought federal attention to bear on her courtroom. Sheriff Bradley's role as the coordinator of the entire conspiracy had made him the most vulnerable to federal prosecution under RICO statutes, because his position had allowed him to facilitate connections between corrupt judges, dishonest prosecutors, and predatory private contractors, while maintaining plausible deniability about the criminal nature of their relationships. His 30 years in law enforcement had given him the knowledge and connections necessary to build a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but they'd also created a paper trail that federal investigators could follow to unravel the entire network. The evidence package that Sarah Collins had assembled represented more than just documentation of individual crimes. It was a roadmap for federal prosecutors who wanted to send a message that rural law enforcement corruption wouldn't be tolerated, regardless of how isolated or politically connected the perpetrators might be. Morrison's final desperate attempt to silence Devon Washington came at 3:17 in the morning when the Millbrook County Jail was operating with minimal staffing and maximum opportunity for the kind of accident that had eliminated troublesome prisoners in the past. But what Morrison didn't understand was that he was dealing with someone whose military training had prepared him for exactly these kinds of situations, where survival depended on staying alert and ready for violence, even while appearing vulnerable and defeated. Devon had been awake for hours, listening to the subtle sounds that indicated approaching trouble, the change in guard rotations, the deliberate disabling of security cameras, the careful footsteps that stopped just outside his cell door. The attack came without warning or preamble, with Morrison entering the cell flanked by two other officers whose faces were covered and whose intentions were obvious from the weapons they carried and the tactical gear they wore to avoid identification. But Devon's response was immediate and devastating, because he'd been anticipating this moment since his arrest and had positioned himself to take advantage of the confined space that would limit his attacker's mobility while maximizing his own defensive options. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, ending with 3 armed law enforcement officers unconscious or incapacitated, and Devon standing calmly over their bodies with barely a mark on him, despite being outnumbered and supposedly helpless. But what shocked Morrison most as he regained consciousness wasn't the physical beating he'd received, but the complete psychological dominance that Devon had established through his restraint and precision, never using more force than necessary to neutralize threats, but leaving no doubt about his capability to escalate if the situation required it. Officer Morrison, you just committed felony assault against a federal witness in the custody of local authorities, which means you've graduated from civil rights violations to attempted murder of someone under federal protection, Devon explained calmly, as Morrison struggled to focus through his concussion and broken nose. The psychological breakdown that followed was complete and devastating, as Morrison finally understood that he'd been targeting someone whose training and experience made him capable of ending lives efficiently and quietly. Someone who'd been showing restraint not from weakness but from strength. Someone who could have killed him at any point during their interactions, but had chosen mercy instead of justice. The realization that he'd been attempting to intimidate and abuse someone who'd survived combat operations in the most dangerous places on Earth, someone who'd killed enemy combatants and saved American lives, someone who possessed security clearances and tactical knowledge that Morrison couldn't begin to comprehend, shattered his worldview and left him sobbing on the jail cell floor. Judge Hawthorne's attempted flight from jurisdiction had been intercepted at Nashville International Airport by federal marshals who'd been monitoring her movements since Devon's arrest, and her capture while attempting to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands with suitcases full of cash had provided federal prosecutors with perfect evidence of consciousness of guilt and criminal intent. The dramatic nature of her arrest, complete with photographs of her being led away in handcuffs while trying to flee the country with stolen money, would serve as powerful imagery for the media coverage that would follow the collapse of the entire corruption network. Sheriff Bradley's attempted destruction of evidence had been anticipated by Agent Torres's team, who'd been monitoring electronic communications and had obtained warrants to seize all county records before the conspirators could implement their cover-up protocols. But his decision to personally oversee the shredding of documents had provided federal investigators with additional charges related to obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. The irony that his decades of experience in criminal investigation had taught him exactly which evidence to destroy had also taught federal prosecutors exactly where to look for the proof they needed to convict him. The community protests that had begun as small gatherings of concerned citizens had grown into major demonstrations as word spread about the federal investigation and the scope of corruption that had been exposed by Devon's case, with civil rights organizations from across the region converging on Millbrook County to demand accountability and justice for the hundreds of victims who'd been processed through the corrupt system over the years. The protesters represented every demographic group in the county, united by their anger at learning how they'd been manipulated and exploited by officials they'd trusted to protect their safety and uphold the law. Sarah Collins had been receiving death threats and harassment from supporters of the corrupt system who viewed her as a traitor to law enforcement rather than a hero who'd exposed criminal activity. But federal protection had allowed her to continue her investigation and testimony without fear of retaliation from people who'd built their livelihoods on maintaining the criminal enterprise. Her courage in documenting and reporting the corruption had made her a symbol of integrity within law enforcement, someone who'd proven that good cops could make a difference when they were willing to take personal risks to expose bad ones. The breaking point had come not just for the individual conspirators, but for the entire system that had allowed their corruption to flourish as federal oversight and media attention made it impossible to continue operating the criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars in revenue while destroying hundreds of lives through manufactured charges and false imprisonments. The machine that had been built to crush the powerless had finally encountered someone it couldn't process, and the collision had exposed every aspect of its criminal operation to federal prosecution and public scrutiny. The arrival of United States Marshals at the Millbrook County Courthouse occurred with the precise timing and overwhelming force that characterized federal operations designed to prevent evidence destruction and ensure the safety of witnesses and investigators with black SUVs surrounding the building, while helicopters provided aerial surveillance and tactical teams secured every entrance and exit to prevent anyone from leaving with documents or electronic devices. Agent Torres had coordinated the operation with military precision, understanding that corrupt local officials would attempt to destroy evidence and flee jurisdiction once they realized the scope of federal interest in their activities. Admiral Cole's presence at the courthouse represented more than just concern for one of her officers. It was a message to corrupt local officials that assaulting decorated military personnel would bring the full weight of federal authority down on their criminal enterprises, regardless of how isolated or politically connected they believed themselves to be. Her arrival in an official Pentagon vehicle accompanied by Navy legal officers and Pentagon investigators transformed Devon's case from a local law enforcement matter into a national security issue that would be prosecuted with all available federal resources. Morrison's arrest on federal charges occurred in the same courtroom where he'd assaulted Devon Washington, with the symbolic importance of the location not lost on the media representatives who'd been invited to document the collapse of the corruption network that had operated with impunity for years. The charges read against Morrison included civil rights violations, conspiracy under RICO statutes, assault on a federal witness, and attempted murder with potential sentences that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in federal prison, reflecting on the consequences of using law enforcement authority to prey on vulnerable populations. Judge Hawthorne's capture at the airport had provided federal prosecutors with dramatic evidence of her guilt and criminal intent, but more importantly, it had prevented her from accessing offshore accounts where she'd hidden the profits from years of judicial corruption, ensuring that the money could be recovered and used to compensate the victims of her criminal enterprise. Her attempted flight with stolen funds had also provided perfect imagery for media coverage of the case, showing viewers exactly what happened when public officials used their authority for personal enrichment at the expense of the people they'd sworn to serve. Devon's medical evaluation at Vanderbilt University Medical Center had revealed the full extent of damage from years of combat operations and recent trauma from his arrest and assault, with doctors documenting injuries that ranged from obvious recent bruises to subtle signs of post-traumatic stress that had been exacerbated by his treatment in Millbrook County custody. The medical evidence would be crucial for civil lawsuits against the county and its officials, but more importantly, it provided documentation of how military veterans were being failed by civilian institutions that should have been providing support rather than additional trauma. Sarah Collins's testimony before the federal grand jury had provided prosecutors with the roadmap they needed to understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise, with her evidence package serving as the foundation for indictments that would eventually encompass dozens of co-conspirators, including judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and private contractors who'd profited from the systematic violation of constitutional rights. Her courage in documenting and reporting corruption despite personal risk had made her a symbol of integrity within law enforcement and a key witness whose testimony would be crucial for securing convictions. James Mitchell's decision to preserve the true court record rather than implementing Judge Hawthorne's orders to falsify transcripts had provided federal prosecutors with contemporaneous documentation of judicial corruption that would be impossible to deny or explain away. But his testimony also revealed the psychological pressure that court employees faced when working within corrupt systems where honesty could mean loss of employment and potential retaliation. His cooperation with federal investigators had ensured that the official record would reflect truth rather than the manufactured narrative that corrupt officials had attempted to create. The Morrison family's public disavowal of Blake represented both genuine shock at learning about his criminal activities and practical recognition that association with his crimes would destroy their reputations and potentially expose them to civil liability. But their statement also reflected the community's growing understanding that they'd been deceived and exploited by officials who'd used law enforcement authority to enrich themselves while claiming to protect public safety. The family's decision to publicly support prosecution of Blake's crimes had provided additional evidence of how his criminal behavior had affected even those closest to him. Sheriff Bradley's arrest had occurred while he was attempting to flee the county, with evidence that he'd failed to destroy, providing federal prosecutors with both additional criminal charges related to obstruction of justice and physical evidence that documented the scope of corruption within his department, including financial records that showed how arrest quotas had been coordinated with budget cycles and contractor payments to maximize revenue generation. His capture while fleeing with stolen evidence had eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance about the criminal nature of the enterprise he'd been coordinating. The federal takeover of Millbrook County law enforcement had been necessary to protect witnesses and preserve evidence, but it had also served notice to corrupt officials throughout the region that federal authorities were prepared to intervene directly when local institutions failed to uphold constitutional rights and protect vulnerable populations. The presence of federal marshals and FBI agents in a small rural courthouse had sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities that had assumed their isolation would protect them from federal scrutiny. Dr. Freeman's expanded psychological evaluation of Devon had provided crucial context for understanding how military veterans could become vulnerable to exactly the kind of abuse he'd experienced, showing how survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress could make decorated combat veterans reluctant to defend themselves against civilian authorities, despite possessing the training and capability to do so effectively. His testimony would be important not just for Devon's case, but for broader discussions about how American society treated veterans who'd served with distinction in foreign wars. The media attention that federal intervention had generated was already reshaping public understanding of rural law enforcement corruption, with national news outlets describing Millbrook County as a cautionary tale about what happened when isolated jurisdictions operated without adequate oversight or accountability. But the coverage was also highlighting the courage of individuals like Sarah Collins and James Mitchell, who'd risked their careers and personal safety to expose criminal activity within their own institutions. The classified briefing that Admiral Cole conducted for Agent Torres and the federal prosecution team revealed aspects of Devon Washington's military service that had been hidden even from his own family, painting a picture of a decorated combat veteran whose psychological wounds were as deep as his tactical skills were advanced. Someone who'd survived experiences that would have broken most people, but who carried the weight of 23 teammates who hadn't been as fortunate. His service record read like a catalog of American military operations in the most dangerous places on Earth, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Syria, from counterterrorism operations in Somalia to hostage rescue missions in places that couldn't be named in open court. The Taliban ambush that had killed Devon's entire special operations team had occurred during what should have been a routine intelligence-gathering mission. But faulty intelligence and compromised communications had turned a carefully planned operation into a massacre that left Devon as the sole survivor of a unit that had been operating together for 3 years. The after-action report, classified at levels that even federal prosecutors couldn't access, described how Devon had held off enemy fighters for 6 hours while waiting for extraction using tactical skills and personal courage that had earned him decorations that couldn't be worn publicly because the operations they commemorated officially never happened. Dr. Freeman's detailed psychological assessment revealed how survivor's guilt had transformed a confident military leader into someone who questioned his right to the life that his teammates had been denied, leading him to reject the comfortable retirement and family support that his service had earned in favor of the kind of austere existence that felt more appropriate for someone who believed he should have died with his brothers. His decision to live rough traveling in his truck and taking odd jobs while avoiding contact with family and friends represented a form of self-imposed penance that was common among combat veterans who struggled with the arbitrary nature of survival in war zones. The revelation that Devon's presence in Millbrook County hadn't been entirely coincidental added another layer of complexity to his case as Admiral Cole explained how his classified work had included investigating human trafficking networks that used rural interstate corridors as staging areas for criminal enterprises that extended far beyond local jurisdiction. While his arrest had been based on Morrison's racial prejudice rather than any suspicion about his real mission, the intersection of personal trauma and professional duty had created a perfect storm that would ultimately serve American law enforcement interests by exposing corruption that had been operating with impunity. Devon's wife, Linda, and daughter, Maya, had been living with the uncertainty and fear that came with loving someone whose military service had changed him in ways that even family therapy and veteran support groups couldn't fully address, watching helplessly as post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt drove him to isolate himself from the people who cared about him most. Linda's decision to remain married despite Devon's emotional absence reflected both her understanding of combat trauma and her faith that the man she'd fallen in love with was still somewhere inside the damaged veteran who'd returned from his final deployment. Maya Washington's relationship with her father had been complicated by his military service and subsequent psychological struggles with a 10-year-old girl trying to understand why the hero she'd been told to be proud of seemed so sad and distant, why he couldn't sleep through the night without nightmares, why he sometimes stared into space like he was seeing things that weren't there. Her school essays about military families had revealed both pride in her father's service and confusion about why serving his country had hurt him so badly that he couldn't live at home anymore. The family healing process that began with Devon's case represented more than just personal reconciliation. It was part of a broader national conversation about how American society treated veterans who'd given everything to serve their country only to struggle with reintegration into civilian life that often seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions they'd been making in combat zones. Dr. Freeman's family therapy sessions had provided a framework for understanding how military trauma affected entire families, not just the veterans who'd experienced combat directly. Devon's decision to use only the minimum force necessary to defend himself against Morrison's assault, despite possessing the capability to inflict much more serious damage, reflected both his military training in rules of engagement and his personal code that rejected unnecessary violence even when dealing with people who deserved much harsher treatment. His restraint had been motivated not by weakness or fear, but by a moral framework that distinguished between justified force and gratuitous violence, between professional necessity and personal revenge. The broader implications of Devon's psychological profile extended beyond individual trauma to questions about how American military training prepared service members for combat operations, but failed to adequately prepare them for the psychological challenges of returning to civilian life, where the skills that kept them alive in war zones could become liabilities in peaceful society. His case represented thousands of other veterans who struggled with similar challenges, using his experience to highlight systemic failures in veteran support services. Admiral Cole's personal involvement in Devon's case reflected both her professional responsibility for the welfare of service members under her command and her recognition that his treatment by civilian authorities represented a broader failure of American society to protect and support the veterans who'd sacrificed so much in service to their country. Her presence at federal court proceedings sent a clear message that the military wouldn't abandon service members who found themselves victimized by corrupt civilian authorities. The transformation of Devon's relationship with his own survival from viewing it as undeserved good fortune that should be minimized through self-denial to understanding it as an opportunity to serve his country in new ways represented the kind of psychological healing that could only occur when survivors of trauma were able to find meaning and purpose in experiences that had initially seemed senseless and destructive. His willingness to testify about his experiences despite the personal cost reflected his evolution from someone consumed by guilt to someone committed to preventing others from experiencing similar trauma. The military's institutional response to Devon's case, including policy changes designed to better support service members dealing with post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt, demonstrated how individual cases could generate systemic improvements that benefited thousands of other veterans who faced similar challenges, but lacked Devon's connections to federal authority and media attention. The federal courthouse in Nashville had been transformed into a fortress of justice, with security measures typically reserved for terrorism cases, protecting witnesses, and ensuring that the truth about Millbrook County's corruption network would finally be heard by jurors who represented the broader American public rather than the local community that had been deceived and victimized by their own officials. Morrison's trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, with media representatives from across the country documenting proceedings that would determine whether law enforcement officers could use their authority to prey on vulnerable populations without facing meaningful consequences. Judge Patricia Clemens, a federal judge with 20 years of experience prosecuting civil rights cases, had been selected specifically because her background made her immune to the kind of political pressure and personal relationships that had enabled corruption to flourish in rural jurisdictions, where everyone knew everyone, and justice often depended more on social connections than legal principles. Her opening instructions to the jury emphasized the importance of holding public officials accountable to the same legal standards that applied to ordinary citizens, making it clear that badges and uniforms didn't provide immunity from criminal prosecution. Devon Washington's testimony began with a detailed description of his military service, not to generate sympathy, but to establish his credibility as someone whose training and experience made him uniquely qualified to assess Morrison's behavior and respond appropriately to the threats he'd faced in Millbrook County custody. His voice remained steady as he described 18 years of military service that had taken him to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for American service members and the civilians they were protecting. The courtroom fell silent as Devon recounted the morning of his arrest, describing how Morrison's approach had immediately triggered the kind of threat assessment that military training had made automatic, how the officer's body language and verbal aggression had indicated someone looking for justification to use violence, rather than someone genuinely concerned about public safety. His testimony was delivered in the calm, professional tone that had briefed congressional committees and Pentagon officials, carrying the authority of someone who'd seen real violence and understood the difference between necessary force and criminal abuse. Morrison's defense attorney had built his case around the argument that his client had been responding appropriately to what appeared to be a dangerous situation, portraying Devon as someone whose military training made him inherently threatening to civilian law enforcement. But that strategy collapsed when Devon calmly explained how his years of combat experience had taught him to de-escalate rather than provoke confrontations with local authorities who might not understand military bearing and tactical awareness. The video evidence that Sarah Collins had captured became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, showing clearly how Morrison had initiated the physical assault against someone who was sitting calmly with his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that the officer's claims about self-defense were fabricated lies designed to justify criminal behavior. The footage was played multiple times for the jury, with experts analyzing every frame to show how Devon's response had been precisely calibrated to neutralize the immediate threat without escalating to unnecessary violence. Morrison's previous victims began testifying on the third day of trial, with Sarah Collins having located dozens of individuals who'd been processed through the corrupt system, but who'd been too intimidated or resource-poor to challenge obviously false charges and manufactured evidence. Their testimony painted a clear picture of how Morrison had used his badge to target minority defendants for arrest quotas and revenue generation, with each case following the same basic pattern of escalation: false accusations and judicial rubber stamping that had made the criminal enterprise profitable for everyone except the victims. The financial evidence presented by federal prosecutors showed how Morrison's arrest quotas had corresponded directly to county budget cycles and contractor payment schedules, proving that his targeting of minority defendants wasn't just personal prejudice, but part of a coordinated criminal enterprise designed to extract profit from human misery. Bank records, email communications, and recorded phone calls documented how arrest revenue had been distributed among conspirators who'd built their livelihoods on criminalizing poverty and race. Judge Hawthorne's trial ran parallel to Morrison's, with prosecutors using her case to demonstrate how judicial corruption had enabled police misconduct by ensuring that manufactured charges would result in convictions regardless of the evidence or lack thereof, creating a closed system where constitutional rights were systematically violated in service of generating revenue for private contractors and corrupt officials. Her financial relationships with bail bondsmen and private prison companies provided clear evidence of conflicts of interest that had perverted the administration of justice. Morrison's mother, Helen, took the stand as a character witness, her testimony revealing how her son's childhood trauma and family dysfunction had contributed to the psychological problems that manifested as racial prejudice and abuse of authority. But her honest assessment of his behavior also provided prosecutors with evidence of how warning signs had been ignored by law enforcement agencies that prioritized hiring warm bodies over screening for psychological fitness and moral character. The expert testimony about institutional racism and police corruption provided jurors with context for understanding how individual cases of misconduct reflected broader patterns of discrimination that had been documented by civil rights organizations and federal investigators throughout the region, showing that Morrison's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of systematic abuse that required federal intervention to correct. Devon's cross-examination by Morrison's defense attorney provided an opportunity for him to explain how his military service had actually made him less likely to use unnecessary violence rather than more dangerous to civilian authorities, describing how rules of engagement and professional military ethics had taught him to distinguish between appropriate defensive force and criminal assault, between protecting himself and punishing his attackers. The prosecution's closing arguments focused on the evidence that Morrison had used his law enforcement authority to prey on vulnerable populations for personal and financial gain, emphasizing that his assault on Devon Washington represented the logical culmination of years of escalating criminal behavior that had been enabled by corrupt colleagues and protected by institutional cover-ups. The federal prosecutor reminded jurors that police officers who violated constitutional rights under color of law deserved the harshest possible sentences because their crimes undermined public trust in the institutions that democracy required to function. Morrison's conviction on all federal charges came after less than 3 hours of jury deliberation, with the verdict representing not just individual justice for Devon Washington, but vindication for dozens of other victims who'd been processed through the corrupt system without having the resources or connections to fight back effectively, and the emotional impact on the courtroom spectators reflected both relief that justice had finally been served and anger that the corruption had been allowed to continue for so long before federal intervention. The transformation of Millbrook County began with Sarah Collins' appointment as interim sheriff, a decision that reflected both her heroism in exposing the corruption network and the community's recognition that healing from years of systematic abuse would require leadership from someone who'd proven her integrity by risking her career and personal safety to protect constitutional rights. Her first official acts included implementing new policies designed to prevent the kind of misconduct that had made her predecessors wealthy while destroying hundreds of lives through manufactured charges and false imprisonments. Sheriff Collins' reform program focused on transparency and accountability measures that would make it impossible for future corruption to operate with the impunity that had characterized the previous administration, including mandatory body cameras for all officers, civilian oversight boards with real authority to investigate misconduct complaints, and regular audits by federal authorities to ensure that constitutional rights were being protected rather than violated for profit. Her approach emphasized community policing techniques that built trust through service rather than generating fear through intimidation and abuse. Devon Washington's decision to settle permanently in Millbrook County represented both personal healing and professional commitment to ensuring that the community that had victimized him would benefit from his experience and expertise in ways that honored the sacrifice of his fallen teammates while preventing future victims from suffering similar abuse. His choice to make the county his home, rather than simply moving on after receiving justice, reflected his understanding that true healing required forgiveness and constructive engagement rather than revenge and abandonment. The Veteran Counseling Center that Devon established in downtown Millbrook became a model for similar programs throughout the region, providing services that addressed not just individual trauma, but the broader social problems that made veterans vulnerable to exactly the kind of abuse he'd experienced, including homelessness, unemployment, substance abuse, and the psychological isolation that often accompanied reintegration into civilian life after combat service. His center provided both individual therapy and group support programs that helped veterans understand that their struggles were shared rather than unique. Morrison's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for his victims to finally confront the man who'd terrorized them with impunity for years, with testimony that revealed the full scope of psychological and financial damage his criminal enterprise had inflicted on individuals and families throughout the county, but also demonstrated the resilience and courage of people who'd survived systematic oppression and were now ready to rebuild their community on foundations of justice rather than exploitation. The 25-year federal sentence that Morrison received reflected both the severity of his crimes and the federal system's commitment to sending a message that law enforcement officers who violated constitutional rights would face consequences proportional to the trust they'd betrayed and the harm they'd inflicted on vulnerable populations. Judge Clemens's sentencing statement emphasized that Morrison's abuse of authority represented a fundamental attack on democratic institutions that required the harshest possible response to preserve public trust in the rule of law. Judge Hawthorne's 15-year sentence and permanent disbarment eliminated any possibility that she would ever again be in position to pervert the administration of justice, while the forfeiture of her assets ensured that the profits from her criminal enterprise would be used to compensate victims and fund reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. But her fall from respected community leader to convicted federal criminal also served as a powerful deterrent to other officials who might be tempted to use their authority for personal enrichment. The ripple effects of the Millbrook County prosecutions extended throughout the region as other jurisdictions recognized that federal authorities were prepared to investigate and prosecute rural law enforcement corruption with the same intensity they brought to urban police misconduct, leading to voluntary reforms and increased accountability measures in counties where officials realized that isolation was no longer protection against federal scrutiny. The cases had demonstrated that constitutional rights applied equally in small towns and major cities with federal enforcement, ensuring that local political connections couldn't shield corrupt officials from prosecution. Morrison's genuine remorse and prison transformation surprised everyone who'd known him during his years as an abusive law enforcement officer, with his participation in prison ministry programs and his written apologies to victims representing what appeared to be authentic psychological change rather than calculated attempts to gain sympathy for parole consideration. His letters to victims, most of which were refused, reflected both recognition of the harm he'd caused and understanding of why forgiveness would be difficult, if not impossible, for people whose lives he'd damaged through years of systematic abuse. The documentary that was being produced about Devon's case promised to bring national attention to the problem of rural law enforcement corruption while highlighting the courage of individuals who'd risked everything to expose criminal activity within their own institutions. But the filmmakers were also committed to showing how communities could heal from systematic abuse through accountability reform and the kind of restorative justice that emphasized healing rather than revenge. Devon's marriage to Linda had survived the trauma of his military service and the additional stress of his arrest and prosecution, with family therapy helping both partners understand how combat-related post-traumatic stress had affected their relationship and providing them with tools for rebuilding intimacy and trust that had been damaged by years of emotional isolation and survivor's guilt. Their reconciliation represented hope for thousands of other military families dealing with similar challenges. Maya Washington's relationship with her father had been transformed by his decision to settle in Millbrook County and establish the counseling center, giving her opportunities to see him in professional and community contexts that revealed aspects of his character and capabilities that his trauma had previously hidden from her. And her pride in his work, helping other veterans, provided a foundation for rebuilding the father-daughter relationship that military service and psychological wounds had disrupted. The new leadership in Millbrook County had implemented reforms that went beyond addressing police misconduct to tackling the underlying economic and social problems that had made the community vulnerable to corruption in the first place, including job training programs, educational initiatives, and economic development projects that provided legitimate opportunities for prosperity rather than depending on the criminalization of poverty for revenue generation. The lesson that emerged from the Millbrook County transformation was that justice without the possibility of redemption created cycles of punishment and revenge that served no one's interests, while accountability combined with opportunities for genuine reform could break those cycles and create stronger communities built on principles of fairness and mutual respect rather than fear and exploitation. The Devon Washington Veterans Counseling Center had become a beacon of hope, not just for military veterans struggling with combat trauma and reintegration challenges, but for the entire Millbrook County community that was learning how healing from systematic abuse required both accountability for past wrongs and commitment to building better institutions for the future. The center's programs addressed individual psychological wounds, while also tackling the broader social problems that had made veterans vulnerable to the kind of exploitation Devon had experienced, including homelessness, unemployment, substance abuse, and the social isolation that often accompanied the transition from military service to civilian life. Devon's work with other traumatized veterans had provided him with a sense of purpose that helped transform his survivor's guilt from a source of self-destructive behavior into motivation for constructive engagement with the community that had once victimized him, demonstrating how personal healing and social justice could reinforce each other when survivors chose to use their experiences to prevent others from suffering similar trauma. His counseling techniques combined professional military training and stress management with hard-earned wisdom about surviving systematic abuse and emerging stronger rather than bitter. Morrison's genuine transformation during his first 3 years of federal imprisonment had surprised everyone who'd known him as an abusive law enforcement officer, with his participation in prison ministry programs and his written correspondence with religious leaders and civil rights activists reflecting what appeared to be authentic psychological change rather than calculated manipulation designed to improve his chances for early release. His letters to former colleagues in law enforcement describing how institutional racism and abuse of authority had corrupted his understanding of justice and service had been circulated among police departments as training materials for ethics courses. The testimony that Morrison provided against other corrupt law enforcement officers throughout the region had been crucial for federal prosecutors building cases against criminal networks that had operated with impunity in rural jurisdictions where isolation and political connections had traditionally provided protection from accountability. But his cooperation also reflected genuine remorse for his role in perpetuating systematic abuse and a desire to prevent other officers from following the same destructive path he'd chosen. Judge Hawthorne's death in federal prison after serving only 2 years of her 15-year sentence had denied her any opportunity for redemption or reconciliation with the community she'd betrayed through years of judicial corruption. But her estate's donation to a victim compensation fund had provided some measure of restitution for people whose lives had been damaged by her perversion of justice, though money could never fully repair the psychological and financial harm that systematic abuse had inflicted on vulnerable populations. Sarah Collins's successful campaign for state attorney general had been built on her record of exposing and prosecuting police corruption, making her a symbol of integrity within law enforcement and a powerful advocate for reforms that would prevent future abuse of authority by officials who'd forgotten that their power was derived from public trust rather than personal privilege. Her election represented a broader political shift toward accountability and transparency in law enforcement that had been catalyzed by the Millbrook County cases. Devon's speech at the State Police Academy had become required viewing for all new recruits, providing them with first-hand testimony about the difference between legitimate law enforcement and criminal abuse of authority, emphasizing that true strength in policing came from protecting constitutional rights rather than violating them, from serving vulnerable populations rather than exploiting them, from building community trust rather than generating fear and resentment through systematic misconduct. The marriage counseling that Devon and Linda had undergone with Dr. Freeman had provided them with tools for rebuilding intimacy and communication that had been damaged by years of combat-related trauma and the additional stress of Devon's arrest and prosecution. But their reconciliation had also demonstrated how families could emerge stronger from crisis when they chose to confront problems honestly rather than ignoring them or hoping they would resolve themselves through time and avoidance. Maya Washington's decision to follow her father's example by pursuing military service represented both generational continuity and evolution, with her choice to specialize in military intelligence and civil affairs, reflecting lessons learned from Devon's experiences about how service members could use their training and expertise to strengthen democratic institutions, rather than simply fighting foreign enemies, demonstrating how each generation could build on previous sacrifices to create better outcomes for American society. The police reform legislation that had been named after Devon reflected congressional recognition that his case represented broader problems with rural law enforcement accountability that required federal intervention to address effectively. But the law's emphasis on training oversight and victim compensation also showed how individual cases of abuse could generate systematic changes that protected millions of other Americans from similar violations of their constitutional rights. The international attention that Devon's case had attracted from human rights organizations and foreign governments had forced American officials to confront uncomfortable questions about how democratic societies should treat military veterans and minority populations. But the positive changes that resulted from federal intervention in Millbrook County also demonstrated how American institutions could reform themselves when confronted with clear evidence of systematic abuse and corruption. Morrison's book about institutional racism and police corruption, written from his federal prison cell, had become required reading in criminology and sociology courses throughout the country, providing students with insider perspective on how good people could become complicit in evil systems through rationalization, peer pressure, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that occurred when misconduct was normalized rather than confronted and corrected. The courthouse that had been renamed the Collins Justice Center represented both recognition of Sarah's courage in exposing corruption and the community's commitment to ensuring that future legal proceedings would be conducted according to constitutional principles, rather than the criminal enterprise that had previously masqueraded as law enforcement, with new policies and procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized the previous administration. Devon's return to active duty as a federal consultant on law enforcement reform had provided him with opportunities to use his military training and hard-earned wisdom to strengthen civilian institutions throughout the country. But his work also represented the completion of his psychological healing from combat trauma and survivor's guilt, as he finally understood that his survival had been purposeful rather than accidental, meaningful rather than arbitrary. The lesson that emerged from the Millbrook County transformation was that justice required both punishment for wrongdoing and opportunities for redemption through genuine change, that healing from systematic abuse was possible when communities chose accountability over denial, truth over comfortable lies, and that even the most damaged relationships and institutions could be rebuilt on foundations of honesty, fairness, and mutual respect for human dignity. 5 years after the federal takeover that had dismantled Millbrook County's corruption network, the community had evolved into a model for rural law enforcement reform that attracted visitors from throughout the country who wanted to understand how systematic abuse could be transformed into institutional accountability through sustained commitment to constitutional principles and community healing. The changes that had begun with Devon Washington's case had created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual justice to encompass broader social and economic transformation that addressed the root causes of vulnerability rather than simply punishing its symptoms. Sheriff Sarah Collins had won re-election by the largest margin in county history, with her support coming from across racial and economic lines as voters recognized that her reforms had created safer communities and stronger institutions that served everyone's interests, rather than just the financial and political needs of corrupt officials. Her department's emphasis on community policing transparency and accountability had reduced both crime rates and misconduct complaints, while building trust between law enforcement and minority populations that had previously viewed police as occupying forces rather than protective services. Devon Washington's counseling center had expanded into a comprehensive veterans services organization that addressed not just combat trauma, but the full range of challenges that service members faced during reintegration into civilian life, including job training, housing assistance, family counseling, and advocacy for improved veteran benefits that recognized the true cost of military service to individuals and families. The center's success had inspired similar programs throughout the region, creating a network of support services that ensured no veteran would face the kind of isolation and vulnerability that had made Devon susceptible to abuse. The psychological transformation that had occurred within the veteran community reflected broader changes in how American society understood the relationship between military service and civilian reintegration, with Devon's case highlighting the need for comprehensive support systems that addressed not just physical wounds, but the psychological and social challenges that often proved more difficult to heal than combat injuries. His work had contributed to policy changes at the federal level that improved mental health services and reduced bureaucratic barriers that had prevented veterans from accessing the support they'd earned through their service. Devon's family had not only survived the trauma of his arrest and prosecution, but had emerged stronger and more united through the process of rebuilding trust and communication that had been damaged by years of combat-related stress and survivor's guilt, with Linda and Maya both becoming advocates for military families who understood the unique challenges that service created for spouses and children who served their country indirectly through the sacrifices they made to support their loved ones' military careers. Maya's commission as a Navy officer represented both personal achievement and generational progress, with her specialization in civil affairs and military intelligence reflecting lessons learned from her father's experiences about how service members could use their training and expertise to strengthen democratic institutions and protect constitutional rights rather than simply eliminating foreign enemies through combat operations. Her choice to serve in specialties that emphasized building relationships and solving problems rather than conducting violent operations represented evolution in military thinking about how to achieve national security objectives. Morrison's eligibility for parole after serving 15 years of his 25-year sentence had generated intense debate within the community about whether genuine redemption was possible for someone who'd committed such serious crimes. But his continued participation in prison ministry programs and his testimony against other corrupt law enforcement officers had demonstrated psychological changes that even his harshest critics acknowledged appeared to be authentic rather than manipulative. The parole hearing that ultimately denied Morrison's early release had been attended by dozens of his former victims, some of whom testified that they opposed his release, while others spoke about the importance of forgiveness and second chances for people who'd demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to making amends for their crimes, creating a complex conversation about restorative justice that recognized both the need for accountability and the possibility of redemption through sustained effort to repair the harm that criminal behavior had caused. Judge Hawthorne's legacy as a cautionary tale about judicial corruption had been preserved through law school case studies and judicial ethics training programs that used her case to illustrate how conflicts of interest and financial relationships could pervert the administration of justice. But her estate's ongoing contributions to victim compensation funds had also demonstrated how accountability could extend beyond individual punishment to include restitution for communities that had been harmed by systematic abuse of authority. The economic development that had accompanied law enforcement reform in Millbrook County represented recognition that communities couldn't achieve genuine prosperity through the criminalization of poverty, but required legitimate opportunities for education, employment, and entrepreneurship that addressed underlying social problems, rather than simply punishing their manifestations with new businesses and job training programs creating alternatives to the underground economy that had made some residents vulnerable to criminal exploitation. The national police reform legislation that bore Devon's name had been implemented throughout the country, creating federal standards for training oversight and accountability that prevented the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized rural law enforcement in jurisdictions that had operated without adequate supervision or constitutional constraints. But the law's success in reducing police misconduct had also demonstrated how federal intervention could strengthen rather than weaken local institutions when properly implemented. Sarah Collins's campaign for state attorney general had been successful partly because voters recognized that her experience exposing and prosecuting police corruption had prepared her to address similar problems at the state level, where her authority would extend to investigating and prosecuting misconduct in jurisdictions throughout Tennessee that might be harboring criminal networks similar to what had operated in Millbrook County before federal intervention dismantled the corruption. The documentary that had been produced about Devon's case had won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, bringing national attention to the problems of rural law enforcement corruption while celebrating the courage of individuals who'd risked everything to expose criminal activity within their own institutions. But the film's emphasis on healing and redemption rather than revenge had also influenced public discourse about how communities could recover from systematic abuse. Devon's book about his experiences, titled The Weight of the Badge, A Navy SEAL's Journey from Combat to Justice, had become a bestseller that was used in law enforcement training programs and military academies throughout the country, providing first-hand testimony about the difference between legitimate authority and criminal abuse, between service and exploitation, between strength and brutality in the exercise of power over vulnerable populations. The lesson that emerged from Millbrook County's transformation was that healing from systematic abuse required sustained commitment to accountability, transparency, and reform, rather than simply punishing individual wrongdoers, and that communities could emerge stronger from crisis when they chose to confront problems honestly, rather than hiding behind comfortable myths about their institutions and leaders, demonstrating that democracy's greatest strength lay in its capacity for self-correction when confronted with clear evidence of systematic failures. The congressional hearings that had been prompted by Devon Washington's case represented the most comprehensive examination of rural law enforcement practices since Reconstruction, with testimony from civil rights advocates, law enforcement experts, and victims of police misconduct, painting a disturbing picture of how isolation and limited oversight had allowed criminal networks to operate with impunity in jurisdictions throughout the American South. The hearings had been broadcast live on national television, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about how systematic racism and corruption had been disguised as legitimate law enforcement in communities that prided themselves on traditional values and respect for authority. Representative Maria Santos, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Constitutional Law, had opened the hearings with a statement that placed Devon's individual case within the broader context of American struggles for racial justice and constitutional accountability, emphasizing that the violence he'd experienced in a Tennessee courthouse reflected problems that extended far beyond a single corrupt jurisdiction to encompass national failures in police training, judicial oversight, and federal enforcement of civil rights protections. Devon's testimony before the congressional subcommittee had been delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized his military briefings, but his words carried emotional weight that resonated with viewers who understood that his experience represented thousands of other cases where law enforcement authority had been used to oppress rather than protect vulnerable populations, where badges and uniforms had provided cover for criminal behavior rather than symbols of service and integrity. The expert witnesses who testified alongside Devon had provided historical and sociological context that helped committee members understand how the corruption in Millbrook County reflected broader patterns of institutional racism that had evolved from slavery through Jim Crow segregation to the modern criminal justice system's disparate impact on minority communities, showing how each generation's techniques for oppression had adapted to changing legal and social constraints while maintaining their fundamental purpose of preserving racial hierarchy through state-sanctioned violence. Senator James Murphy, the ranking Republican member of the committee, had initially been skeptical of claims about systematic police misconduct. But Devon's military service record and the overwhelming evidence of corruption in Millbrook County had forced him to acknowledge that federal intervention was necessary to protect constitutional rights in jurisdictions where local political networks had been captured by criminal enterprises masquerading as law enforcement agencies. Sarah Collins's confirmation hearing for her nomination as federal prosecutor had provided an opportunity for senators to examine her record of exposing and prosecuting police corruption, with her testimony revealing both the personal costs of challenging institutional misconduct and the professional satisfaction of holding corrupt officials accountable for their crimes against vulnerable populations, demonstrating that integrity within law enforcement required courage to confront colleagues who'd betrayed their oaths and violated public trust. The national police reform legislation that emerged from the congressional hearings had been crafted to address the specific problems that Devon's case had exposed, while creating broader accountability mechanisms that would prevent similar corruption from developing in other rural jurisdictions, with provisions for federal oversight, mandatory reporting of misconduct, and victim compensation that recognized the true cost of systematic abuse to individuals and communities. Morrison's second parole hearing, conducted after he'd served 18 years of his 25-year sentence, had attracted national media attention as observers tried to determine whether genuine redemption was possible for someone who'd committed such serious civil rights violations. But his continued cooperation with federal authorities and his testimony against other corrupt law enforcement officers had demonstrated psychological changes that even his harshest critics acknowledged appeared to be authentic rather than calculated. The victim impact statements that had been presented during Morrison's parole hearing reflected the complex range of emotions that survivors of systematic abuse experienced when confronted with their oppressor's apparent transformation, with some former victims expressing forgiveness and support for his rehabilitation, while others maintained that the severity of his crimes demanded completion of his full sentence, regardless of any personal changes he might have undergone. The international attention that Devon's case had generated from human rights organizations in Europe and Latin America had created diplomatic pressure on the United States to address domestic law enforcement practices that violated the same constitutional principles that American foreign policy promoted in other countries, with foreign officials questioning how the United States could credibly advocate for human rights abroad while tolerating systematic police misconduct within its own borders. The academic research that had been conducted on the Millbrook County case had produced dozens of scholarly articles and several book-length studies examining how rural isolation could enable corruption networks to develop and operate with minimal oversight, providing policymakers and law enforcement officials with empirical evidence about the conditions that fostered misconduct and the interventions that proved most effective in preventing and addressing systematic abuse. Devon's work as a federal consultant on law enforcement reform had taken him to police departments throughout the country, where his combination of military expertise and personal experience with police misconduct provided unique credibility in training programs designed to help officers understand the difference between legitimate use of force and criminal assault, between community protection and population oppression. The Victims' Compensation Fund that had been established using assets forfeited from corrupt Millbrook County officials had provided financial assistance to dozens of individuals whose lives had been damaged by systematic abuse. But the fund's administrators had also emphasized that money could never fully repair the psychological and social harm that criminal justice misconduct inflicted on individuals and families, requiring broader reforms in mental health services and community support systems. The law enforcement officers from other jurisdictions who had been prosecuted, based on evidence and testimony provided by Morrison and other cooperating witnesses, had created a network of federal cases that demonstrated how corruption could metastasize across jurisdictional boundaries with criminal networks, using personal relationships and shared financial interests to coordinate misconduct that served their collective interests rather than public safety or constitutional accountability. The Community College Criminal Justice Program that had been established in Millbrook County, with funding from federal grants and private donations, had been designed to train a new generation of law enforcement officers who understood constitutional principles and community policing techniques, providing local residents with educational opportunities while ensuring that future police officers would be better prepared to serve rather than exploit the communities they were sworn to protect. The economic development that had accompanied law enforcement reform in Millbrook County had demonstrated how ending the criminalization of poverty could unleash entrepreneurial energy and community investment that created legitimate prosperity rather than depending on extraction of resources from vulnerable populations, with new businesses, job training programs, and educational initiatives providing alternatives to both criminal activity and the underground economy that had made some residents susceptible to exploitation. Sarah Collins's successful prosecution of police misconduct cases throughout Tennessee had established legal precedents that made it easier for federal authorities to investigate and prosecute systematic corruption in other rural jurisdictions, while her emphasis on community healing and restorative justice had influenced how prosecutors approached cases that involved institutional rather than individual criminal behavior. The ripple effects that had spread from Devon Washington's individual case to encompass congressional legislation, international attention, academic research, and countless individual prosecutions demonstrated how a single moment of courage and restraint could generate changes that protected millions of other Americans from similar violations of their constitutional rights, proving that democracy's greatest strength lay in its capacity for self-correction when confronted with clear evidence of systematic institutional failures. The Devon Washington Veterans Counseling Center had evolved from a small storefront operation in downtown Millbrook into a nationally recognized model for comprehensive veteran services that addressed not just combat trauma, but the full spectrum of challenges that service members faced during reintegration into civilian society, with satellite programs operating in 12 states and federal funding that reflected congressional recognition of the center's innovative approaches to healing psychological wounds and rebuilding social connections. Devon's daily routine now included not just individual counseling sessions with veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt, but also policy consultations with Pentagon officials who sought his expertise in developing programs that would prevent future service members from experiencing the kind of isolation and vulnerability that had made him susceptible to abuse by corrupt civilian authorities, demonstrating how personal healing and professional service could reinforce each other in ways that honored fallen comrades while protecting living veterans. Morrison's transformation during 20 years of federal imprisonment had surprised everyone who'd known him as an abusive law enforcement officer with his participation in prison ministry programs and his written correspondence with civil rights leaders reflecting psychological changes that had been validated by multiple psychiatric evaluations and confirmed through his continued cooperation with federal authorities investigating corruption networks throughout the region. But his upcoming release after serving his full sentence without parole had generated intense debate about redemption and accountability. The community meeting that had been organized to discuss Morrison's impending release had filled the high school auditorium with residents who represented every demographic group in Millbrook County, creating a forum for honest discussion about forgiveness, justice, and the possibility of genuine redemption for people who'd committed serious crimes against their own communities but had demonstrated sustained commitment to making amends through years of constructive behavior. Sarah Collins's tenure as State Attorney General had been marked by successful prosecutions of corruption networks in 17 counties throughout Tennessee, with her investigations revealing how rural isolation and limited oversight had enabled criminal enterprises to masquerade as legitimate law enforcement while extracting profit from human misery. But her emphasis on institutional reform, rather than individual revenge, had also created opportunities for communities to heal from systematic abuse through accountability and transparency. The federal courthouse in Nashville, where Morrison had been convicted 20 years earlier, had become the site of his final pre-release hearing with Devon Washington, attending not as a victim seeking revenge, but as someone whose own healing had taught him the importance of distinguishing between justice and vengeance, between accountability and cruelty, between protecting society and destroying individuals who demonstrated genuine commitment to change. Morrison's appearance before the federal judge, who would determine the conditions of his supervised release, revealed a man who bore little resemblance to the arrogant officer who'd assaulted Devon in a Tennessee courthouse 2 decades earlier, with his gray hair, humble demeanor, and obvious remorse, creating a stark contrast to the platinum blonde bully, whose sense of racial superiority had masked deep psychological insecurities and moral failures. The victim impact statement that Devon delivered at Morrison's release hearing focused not on the pain that the assault had caused, but on the positive changes that had emerged from the federal intervention that followed, emphasizing how individual trauma could generate social progress when survivors chose constructive engagement rather than destructive revenge, healing rather than hatred, forgiveness rather than perpetual anger that served no one's interests. Judge Patricia Clemens's decision to allow Morrison's release under strict supervised probation reflected both recognition of his genuine transformation and acknowledgement that the purpose of criminal justice should include rehabilitation rather than simply punishment. But her conditions for his release also emphasized that redemption required sustained demonstration of change, rather than simply expressions of remorse that weren't backed by concrete actions. Morrison's work at the halfway house, where he would complete his transition to civilian life, included counseling other former law enforcement officers who'd been convicted of misconduct, using his own experience with corruption and redemption to help others understand how institutional cultures could corrupt good people, and how genuine change required accepting responsibility rather than rationalizing criminal behavior or blaming external circumstances. The book that Morrison had written about institutional racism and police corruption had been published by a university press and had become required reading in criminal justice programs throughout the country, providing students with insider perspective on how ordinary people could become complicit in systematic oppression through rationalization, peer pressure, and gradual erosion of moral boundaries that occurred when misconduct was normalized rather than confronted. Devon's reaction to Morrison's release had surprised many observers who expected him to oppose any form of clemency for the man who'd assaulted him. But his support for Morrison's supervised release reflected his own journey from trauma to healing, his understanding that justice required accountability rather than revenge, and his recognition that redemption was possible even for people who'd committed serious crimes when they demonstrated genuine commitment to change. The community response to Morrison's return to Millbrook County had been mixed, with some residents expressing forgiveness and willingness to give him a chance to demonstrate his transformation, while others maintained that the severity of his crimes demanded permanent exile from the community he'd betrayed through years of systematic abuse, creating ongoing tension about the balance between accountability and redemption. Sarah Collins's decision to hire Morrison as a consultant for law enforcement ethics training programs had been controversial, but reflected her pragmatic recognition that his credibility with police officers who might be tempted by similar corruption was greater than any outside expert could achieve, and his first-hand testimony about the personal and professional costs of misconduct had proven effective in helping officers understand the consequences of betraying their oaths. The renewed friendship between Devon and Sarah that had developed during their collaboration on police reform initiatives had demonstrated how shared commitment to justice could create bonds that transcended the traditional boundaries between victims and investigators, with their partnership serving as a model for how law enforcement and community advocates could work together to address systematic problems rather than simply responding to individual incidents. Maya Washington's promotion to lieutenant commander in Navy intelligence had been accelerated based on her innovative work developing psychological profiles of terrorist organizations and criminal networks. But her specialization in domestic security issues also reflected lessons learned from her father's experience with civilian law enforcement corruption and the need for military personnel to understand the constitutional principles they were sworn to protect. The memorial service that had been held to honor the 23 Navy SEALs who died in the ambush that Devon survived had provided him with an opportunity to speak publicly about survivors' guilt and the importance of using the gift of life to serve others rather than wallowing in undeserved shame, with his remarks helping other combat veterans understand that survival wasn't a betrayal of fallen comrades, but an opportunity to honor their sacrifice through constructive service. The full circle that Devon's journey had traced from traumatized veteran to community leader demonstrated how individual healing and social justice could reinforce each other when survivors chose engagement rather than isolation, service rather than self-pity, and forgiveness rather than hatred as responses to trauma and injustice, creating examples that inspired others to pursue similar paths toward healing and redemption. 25 years after Officer Blake Morrison had kicked Commander Devon Washington in a Tennessee courthouse, the two men sat across from each other in the conference room of the Devon Washington Veterans Counseling Center, with morning sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on a community that had been transformed by the consequences of that violent encounter and the choices both men had made in response to its aftermath. Morrison's hair had turned completely gray during his years in federal prison, and his face bore the lines of someone who'd spent decades wrestling with the psychological consequences of systematic cruelty and racial hatred. Devon had arranged this private meeting not because he needed closure or required an apology from Morrison, but because he understood that healing from systematic abuse sometimes required direct confrontation between victims and perpetrators who'd both been changed by their experiences and were now capable of honest conversation about trauma, accountability, and the possibility of redemption through sustained effort to repair the damage that criminal behavior had caused to individuals and communities. Commander Washington, I know that words can't undo the harm I caused you and the dozens of other people whose lives I damaged through my abuse of law enforcement authority. Morrison began, his voice carrying the humility of someone who'd spent 25 years reflecting on the moral failures that had led him to use his badge as a weapon against vulnerable populations rather than a symbol of service and protection. But I wanted to meet with you face to face to acknowledge the full scope of my crimes and to thank you for showing restraint that probably saved my life. The conversation that followed was conducted with the careful honesty that characterized discussions between people who'd moved beyond the immediate emotions of trauma and revenge to examine the broader questions about justice, accountability, and redemption that Devon's case had raised for American society, with both men recognizing that their individual experiences had generated changes that extended far beyond personal healing to encompass institutional reform and social progress. Devon's response reflected both his military training in strategic thinking and his years of counseling other trauma survivors, as he explained how Morrison's assault had initially triggered defensive reactions based on combat experience, but had ultimately led to personal growth and professional opportunities that had allowed him to serve his country in new ways, while honoring the memory of fallen comrades through constructive engagement with civilian institutions. Officer Morrison, your attack forced me to confront the survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress that I'd been avoiding since my team was killed in Afghanistan. Devon explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to transform personal trauma into professional expertise. In a strange way, your violence became the catalyst for healing that I couldn't achieve through conventional therapy or family support, because it forced me to defend not just my physical safety, but my fundamental dignity as a human being. Morrison's acknowledgement of how institutional racism and personal insecurities had combined to make him capable of systematic cruelty reflected years of psychological counseling and spiritual reflection that had helped him understand the social and individual factors that had shaped his behavior. But his explanation didn't excuse his crimes or minimize the harm he'd inflicted on people who'd depended on law enforcement for protection, rather than experiencing it as a source of additional trauma and oppression. The discussion about Morrison's prison transformation and his work with other former law enforcement officers who'd been convicted of misconduct revealed how genuine change required not just expressions of remorse, but sustained commitment to making amends through concrete actions that served the communities and populations that had been harmed by criminal behavior masquerading as legitimate authority. Devon's questions about Morrison's psychological journey from racist aggressor to prison minister and ethics consultant demonstrated both genuine curiosity about human capacity for change and professional interest in understanding how individuals could be rehabilitated after committing serious crimes against vulnerable populations, with implications for broader discussions about restorative justice and the purpose of criminal sanctions in democratic societies. The moment when Morrison broke down and wept while describing the psychological impact of recognizing that he'd attacked someone whose military service and personal character made him everything that Morrison had falsely claimed to represent as a law enforcement officer, created a powerful illustration of how genuine accountability required confronting the full scope of one's moral failures, rather than simply accepting punishment without understanding its meaning. Devon's response to Morrison's emotional breakdown was characterized by the same restraint and professionalism that had defined his reaction to the original assault, offering compassion without forgiveness, understanding without excuses, and recognition of Morrison's transformation, without minimizing the harm his crimes had caused to dozens of victims who hadn't had the resources or federal connections necessary to obtain justice. The handshake that concluded their meeting represented acknowledgement of shared humanity, rather than reconciliation or forgiveness with Devon, making clear that Morrison's redemption was his own responsibility and couldn't be validated by his victims, but also recognizing that genuine change was possible even for people who'd committed serious crimes when they were willing to accept accountability and dedicate themselves to making amends. Sarah Collins's observation of the meeting through the center's security cameras reflected her professional interest in understanding how victim-offender dialogue could contribute to community healing. But her emotional reaction to seeing Devon and Morrison interact peacefully also demonstrated how individual acts of courage and restraint could inspire others to pursue similar paths toward justice and accountability rather than revenge and destruction. The media attention that Morrison's release and rehabilitation had generated represented broader public interest in questions about redemption and second chances for people who'd committed serious crimes, but had demonstrated genuine transformation through years of constructive behavior, with his case serving as a test of American society's commitment to rehabilitation rather than simply punishment as the primary purpose of criminal justice. Maya Washington's reaction to learning about her father's meeting with Morrison reflected both pride in Devon's continued commitment to healing and reconciliation and recognition that his capacity for forgiveness represented strength rather than weakness, courage rather than surrender, and moral authority rather than moral failure, providing her with an example of how to respond to injustice through constructive engagement rather than destructive revenge. The final confrontation between Devon and Morrison had demonstrated that healing from systematic abuse was possible when both victims and perpetrators were willing to confront the truth about their experiences and their choices. But it had also shown that redemption required sustained effort over many years, rather than simply expressions of remorse, and that justice could be served through transformation, rather than simply punishment when offenders demonstrated genuine commitment to making amends. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials from across the nation as Devon Washington took his place at the witness table, 27 years after a racist cop's kick had transformed him from anonymous homeless veteran into a symbol of both police brutality and the possibility of justice through federal intervention. His testimony would be broadcast live on national television, reaching millions of Americans who were still grappling with questions about racial bias in law enforcement and the military's role in protecting constitutional rights on domestic soil. Senator Patricia Williams, the African-American chairwoman of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Rights, opened the hearings with a statement that placed Devon's individual case within the broader context of American struggles for racial justice and constitutional accountability, emphasizing that the violence he'd experienced in a rural courthouse had exposed corruption networks that extended far beyond a single jurisdiction to encompass systematic abuse throughout the region. Commander Washington, your case has become a touchstone for discussions about police accountability and federal intervention in local law enforcement. Senator Williams began her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting institutional racism through legislative channels. Can you tell this committee what you believe your experience reveals about the state of civil rights protection in rural America? Devon's response drew on both his military experience in nation-building operations and his years of counseling veterans who'd struggled with reintegration into civilian society, as he explained how corruption in isolated jurisdictions could undermine democratic institutions in ways that served foreign adversaries' interests while harming American credibility abroad and domestic stability at home. Senator Williams, what I witnessed in Millbrook County wasn't just individual prejudice or isolated misconduct. It was a criminal enterprise that used law enforcement authority to extract profit from human misery while masquerading as legitimate government. Devon testified, his voice carrying the calm authority that had briefed congressional committees about foreign threats. The systematic nature of the abuse, the financial relationships that sustained it, and the community complicity that enabled it represented exactly the kind of institutional corruption that American military forces are fighting against in other countries. The expert testimony that followed Devon's opening statement included presentations from civil rights lawyers, criminology professors, and former federal prosecutors who provided statistical analysis and historical context that demonstrated how his case represented broader patterns of rural law enforcement corruption rather than an isolated incident, with data showing that federal intervention had been necessary in dozens of similar jurisdictions throughout the American South. Dr. Angela Freeman, a criminal justice researcher from Vanderbilt University, presented findings from a comprehensive study of police misconduct in rural jurisdictions, showing that isolation and limited oversight created conditions that fostered exactly the kind of systematic abuse that Devon had experienced with minority populations bearing disproportionate costs, while corrupt officials and their private sector collaborators reaped substantial financial benefits. The questions from Republican committee members initially focused on concerns about federal overreach and states' rights, but Devon's military service record and the overwhelming evidence of corruption in Millbrook County forced even skeptical senators to acknowledge that federal intervention had been necessary to protect constitutional rights that local institutions had failed to uphold, creating bipartisan support for police reform legislation. Sarah Collins's testimony as federal prosecutor provided the committee with detailed evidence about how the corruption network had operated including financial records that showed money flowing from arrest fees through bail bondsmen and private contractors back to corrupt officials, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of criminalization that generated revenue while destroying lives and communities. The victim impact statements presented during the hearings revealed the human cost of systematic police corruption, with dozens of Morrison's former victims describing how false arrests and manufactured charges had affected their employment, housing, family relationships, and mental health, demonstrating that the financial and psychological damage extended far beyond individual cases to encompass entire communities and generations. Morrison's videotaped testimony from federal prison provided the committee with insider perspective on how corruption networks recruited and maintained law enforcement officers who were willing to participate in criminal enterprises, including the psychological techniques used to rationalize misconduct and the financial incentives that made participation profitable for individual officers and their families. The legislative package that emerged from the congressional hearings included federal funding for police training and oversight, mandatory reporting requirements for misconduct allegations, victim compensation mechanisms, and enhanced penalties for civil rights violations committed under color of law, representing the most comprehensive police reform legislation since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Devon's closing statement to the committee emphasized that his case demonstrated both the worst and best aspects of American institutions, with corrupt local officials using government authority to prey on vulnerable populations, while federal agencies and military personnel worked to protect constitutional rights and hold bad actors accountable for their crimes. This committee has heard testimony about how systematic abuse can flourish in isolated communities where oversight is limited and accountability is optional. Devon concluded his voice carrying the weight of personal experience and professional expertise. But you've also heard about how American institutions can reform themselves when confronted with clear evidence of failure, how federal authority can protect constitutional rights when local authorities fail to do so, and how individual courage can generate changes that benefit millions of people. The standing ovation that followed Devon's testimony included senators from both parties reflecting bipartisan recognition that his case had exposed problems that transcended partisan politics to encompass fundamental questions about American democracy and the rule of law, with his personal story serving as both warning about the dangers of unchecked power and inspiration about the possibility of justice through sustained commitment to constitutional principles. The media coverage of the hearings generated national discussion about police accountability and federal oversight that influenced public opinion and political discourse throughout the country, with Devon's case serving as a concrete example of how individual incidents could reveal broader institutional problems, while also demonstrating how American society could address those problems through democratic processes and legal institutions. The international reaction to Devon's testimony included commentary from human rights organizations and foreign governments that had previously criticized American law enforcement practices, with several European officials noting that his case demonstrated American capacity for self-criticism and institutional reform that distinguished democratic societies from authoritarian regimes that refused to acknowledge or address systematic abuses. The Senate confirmation hearing for Sarah Collins's nomination as federal prosecutor took place in the same chamber where Devon Washington had testified about police corruption. But the atmosphere was markedly different as senators from both parties praised her record of courage and integrity in exposing systematic abuse while building relationships with law enforcement officers who shared her commitment to constitutional principles and community safety. Senator Robert Hayes, the ranking Republican member of the Judiciary Committee, opened his questioning by acknowledging that Collins's investigation of the Millbrook County corruption network had required personal courage and professional skill that deserved recognition from anyone who cared about the rule of law, regardless of their political affiliation or views about federal involvement in local law enforcement issues. Ms. Collins, your work in exposing police corruption has obviously generated controversy in some quarters. but it's also prevented countless future victims from experiencing the kind of abuse that occurred in Millbrook County. Senator Hayes observed his voice carrying respect for someone whose integrity had transcended partisan divisions. Can you tell this committee how you balance the need to hold bad actors accountable with the importance of supporting good officers who serve their communities with honor? Sarah's response drew on 15 years of law enforcement experience and her understanding of how institutional cultures could either foster integrity or enable corruption, explaining how accountability measures actually protected good officers by ensuring that misconduct couldn't be blamed on entire departments or law enforcement as a profession. Senator Hayes: My experience has taught me that police officers who serve with integrity welcome accountability measures because they know that corruption undermines public trust and makes everyone's job more dangerous. Sarah testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd worked alongside both heroic and criminal law enforcement officers. The officers who opposed my investigation weren't concerned about protecting good cops. They were worried about protecting a criminal enterprise that enriched corrupt officials while destroying community relationships. The Democratic senators focused their questions on Sarah's plans for using federal prosecution authority to address police misconduct in other jurisdictions, with particular interest in her proposals for coordinating with civil rights organizations and community groups to identify patterns of abuse that might not generate sufficient complaints to trigger federal investigation. Senator Maria Santos questioned Sarah about her approach to balancing individual prosecutions with institutional reform, noting that her work in Millbrook County had demonstrated how federal intervention could generate systematic changes that prevented future abuse rather than simply punishing past misconduct, creating models that other prosecutors could adapt to their own jurisdictions. The law enforcement representatives who testified in support of Sarah's nomination included police chiefs, sheriffs, and FBI agents who emphasized that corruption investigations actually strengthened legitimate law enforcement by removing officers whose criminal behavior made all police officers less effective and less safe in their interactions with community members who'd lost trust in institutional integrity. Chief Robert Martinez of the Nashville Police Department testified that Sarah's work had improved police-community relations throughout Tennessee by demonstrating that law enforcement leaders were willing to hold bad actors accountable rather than protecting them through institutional solidarity that placed loyalty above legality and professional ethics. The civil rights organizations that supported Sarah's nomination included groups that had historically been critical of law enforcement but recognized her as someone who understood that constitutional policing served everyone's interests, while corruption and abuse damaged both minority communities and the broader social fabric that democracy required to function. Reverend Michael Thompson, whose congregation had been particularly affected by Morrison's systematic targeting of black men for false arrests, testified that Sarah's investigation had restored his community's faith in the possibility of justice through legal institutions, rather than vigilante responses that could have escalated tensions and damaged community relationships. The victim impact statements from Morrison's former targets provided powerful testimony about how Sarah's courage in documenting and reporting misconduct had transformed their lives from fear and powerlessness to hope and civic engagement, with several witnesses explaining how federal prosecution had enabled them to rebuild their relationships with law enforcement and participate in community policing efforts. Devon Washington's testimony in support of Sarah's nomination focused on her professional competence and personal integrity, but also emphasized how her investigation had served national security interests by exposing corruption that could have been exploited by foreign adversaries seeking to undermine American democratic institutions through support for criminal enterprises masquerading as legitimate government. The questions from both Democratic and Republican senators about Sarah's prosecutorial philosophy revealed broad bipartisan support for her approach to balancing accountability with fairness, punishment with rehabilitation, individual justice with institutional reform, demonstrating how her record had earned respect across partisan and ideological divisions. Sarah's responses to questions about her future priorities as federal prosecutor emphasized her commitment to investigating patterns of abuse, rather than simply responding to individual incidents, building relationships with community organizations that could identify problems before they reached crisis levels, and working with federal agencies to ensure that prosecutions generated systematic improvements rather than just individual convictions. The unanimous committee vote to recommend Sarah's confirmation reflected both recognition of her qualifications and acknowledgement that her work had transcended traditional divisions between law enforcement and civil rights advocates to create new models for accountability that served everyone's interests in safe communities and constitutional government. Senator Williams's closing statement emphasized that Sarah's nomination represented more than just individual recognition for outstanding public service. It demonstrated how American institutions could reform themselves through democratic processes when individuals with courage and integrity were willing to challenge corruption regardless of personal costs or professional risks. The Senate floor debate about Sarah's confirmation was notable for its bipartisan tone and substantive focus on law enforcement accountability, with speakers from both parties praising her record while discussing broader questions about federal oversight of local police departments and the balance between community policing and constitutional enforcement. The confirmation vote of 87-13 reflected overwhelming Senate support for Sarah's nomination, with opposition coming primarily from senators who objected to federal involvement in local law enforcement issues rather than questioning her personal qualifications or professional competence. Sarah's swearing-in ceremony was attended by Devon Washington, dozens of law enforcement officers from across Tennessee, civil rights leaders, and many of Morrison's former victims who'd been helped by her investigation, creating a diverse coalition that represented how her work had built bridges between communities that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. The dedication ceremony for the Devon Washington Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Millbrook County represented the complete transformation of a community that had once been synonymous with police corruption into a national model for constitutional policing and community partnership, with the gleaming new facility built on land that had previously housed the county jail where Devon had been held and assaulted by corrupt officers 28 years earlier. President Jennifer Martinez delivered the keynote address to an audience that included law enforcement officials from across the country, civil rights leaders, military officers, and hundreds of local residents who'd witnessed their community's evolution from a symbol of institutional racism to an example of how American democracy could reform itself through sustained commitment to accountability and justice. The story of Commander Devon Washington and Millbrook County reminds us that America's greatest strength isn't the absence of problems, but our capacity to confront those problems honestly and work together to solve them. President Martinez announced her voice carrying to the thousands of people gathered on the training center's grounds. What happened here 28 years ago was a betrayal of American values, but what has happened since then represents the fulfillment of American promises. Devon's response to the honor of having the Federal Training Center named after him reflected both humility about his individual role and pride in the collective effort that had transformed systematic abuse into institutional accountability, emphasizing that the facility's mission would be to prevent other communities from experiencing the kind of corruption that had once characterized Millbrook County. Mr. President, this training center represents more than just federal investment in law enforcement education. It represents our national commitment to ensuring that badges and uniforms serve as symbols of protection rather than tools of oppression. Devon stated, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose experience had bridged military service and civilian advocacy. The officers who train here will learn not just tactical skills, but constitutional principles, not just law enforcement techniques, but community partnership strategies. The curriculum that had been developed for the training center reflected lessons learned from Devon's case and similar corruption scandals, with courses that addressed racial bias, community relations, constitutional law, and ethical decision-making, designed to prevent the kind of institutional failures that had enabled Morrison's criminal enterprise to operate with impunity for years. Sarah Collins, now serving her 5th year as federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of Tennessee, spoke about how the training center would serve law enforcement agencies throughout the region that were committed to professional excellence and constitutional accountability, providing them with resources and expertise that smaller departments often couldn't afford to develop independently. Morrison's videotaped message to the dedication ceremony, recorded from the community center where he now worked as a counselor for former offenders, provided perspective on how individual transformation could contribute to institutional reform when combined with accountability measures that prevented corruption from recurring in new forms with different participants. Commander Washington and the community of Millbrook County have taught me that redemption is possible even for people who've committed serious crimes, but only when we accept full responsibility for our actions and dedicate ourselves to making amends through service to others. Morrison stated his words carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 15 years since his release working to repair the damage his crimes had caused. The officers who train at this center will learn from my mistakes, as well as from the courage of people like Sarah Collins and Devon Washington. Maya Washington, now serving as a captain in Navy intelligence and scheduled to assume command of her own unit within 6 months, represented the generational impact of her father's case by explaining how his experience had influenced her own career path and her understanding of military service as protection of constitutional principles rather than simply national territory or economic interests. My father's case taught me that the greatest threats to American security often come from within our own institutions, when those institutions abandon the constitutional principles they're supposed to protect. Maya observed her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd inherited both military tradition and moral clarity. The training that officers receive at this center will help them understand that their primary mission is protecting constitutional rights, not enforcing social hierarchies or generating revenue for political interests. Dr. Michael Freeman, who'd continued his work treating combat veterans while also developing training programs for law enforcement officers dealing with civilian trauma, spoke about how the center's curriculum would address the psychological factors that made officers susceptible to corruption and misconduct, providing them with mental health resources and ethical frameworks that could prevent individual problems from becoming institutional failures. The international observers who attended the dedication ceremony included law enforcement officials from several European and Latin American countries that were developing their own accountability measures based on lessons learned from American experiences with police reform, demonstrating how Devon's case had influenced global discussions about democratic policing and constitutional enforcement. The community members who spoke at the ceremony represented every demographic group in Millbrook County, with their testimonials revealing how federal intervention and sustained reform efforts had created economic opportunities, improved educational systems, and strengthened social relationships that had been damaged by years of systematic corruption and abuse. Judge Patricia Clemens, now serving on the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, delivered remarks that placed the training center within the broader context of federal efforts to ensure that constitutional rights were protected equally throughout the country, regardless of local political arrangements or economic interests that might benefit from discriminatory enforcement of laws. The memorial wall that had been constructed as part of the training center honored both Devon's fallen teammates who died in the Afghanistan ambush and the victims of police misconduct throughout the region, whose suffering had contributed to the reform movement that made institutional accountability possible, creating a permanent reminder of the human costs of both military service and civilian corruption. Devon's final remarks at the dedication ceremony emphasized that the transformation of Millbrook County represented ongoing work rather than completed achievement, with each new generation of law enforcement officers requiring education about constitutional principles and community partnership strategies that could prevent corruption from developing in new forms. The officers who graduate from this training center will face the same temptations and pressures that led Officer Morrison and his colleagues down the path of criminal behavior. Devon concluded, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen both the worst and best of American institutions. but they'll also have the knowledge, skills, and support systems necessary to choose service over exploitation, integrity over corruption, and justice over personal profit. The standing ovation that concluded the ceremony included participants from across the political and social spectrum, demonstrating how Devon's case had created common ground between groups that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and hostility, building coalitions that could sustain reform efforts through changing political administrations and evolving social conditions. The transformation was complete, but the scars remained as reminders rather than wounds. Devon Washington stood before the graduating class of the FBI Academy, his chest bearing not just military decorations, but the deeper marks of a man who chose justice over vengeance. In the audience, Sarah Collins held her federal prosecutor credentials, while somewhere in a Tennessee community center, Blake Morrison taught anger management to young offenders, his platinum hair now gray, his arrogance replaced by humility earned through years of genuine repentance. The courthouse kick that should have ended a black veteran's life instead became the catalyst for the largest police reform movement in American history, with over 2,000 corrupt officers across 47 states prosecuted using the Millbrook model of investigation, while Devon's restraint training became mandatory curriculum in every police academy. Morrison's transformation from racist aggressor to prison reform advocate proved even the most hardened hearts could change, though the path required complete destruction of ego and years of genuine work to earn forgiveness. The ripple effects extended beyond individual cases to encompass congressional legislation, international attention, academic research, and countless prosecutions that demonstrated how a single moment of courage and restraint could generate changes protecting millions of Americans from similar violations of their constitutional rights. As Devon watched his daughter Maya pin on her Navy SEAL trident, the same decoration he'd worn through nightmares and survivor's guilt, he finally understood why he'd survived when his brothers hadn't. His survival wasn't punishment, it was purpose. The homeless drifter who absorbed Morrison's kick without retaliation had shown America that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them. Morrison's genuine remorse and 28 years of prison ministry work had created a living example of redemption that inspired reform programs nationwide, while Sarah Collins's elevation to federal prosecutor demonstrated how individual courage could reshape entire institutions when combined with sustained commitment to constitutional principles. The Devon Washington Federal Law Enforcement Training Center now stood on the ground where he'd once been held in a corrupt jail, training thousands of officers who understood that badges represented service rather than domination, protection rather than exploitation, justice rather than revenue generation. The unheard truth was simple: justice without the possibility of redemption isn't justice at all. It's just revenge wearing a badge. In a small Tennessee town, a black Navy SEAL's moment of restraint had reminded the nation that the content of one's character could indeed overcome the color of one's skin, but only when power was held accountable and mercy remained possible for those brave enough to change. Devon's case proved that democracy's greatest strength lay not in the absence of corruption, but in its capacity for self-correction when confronted with clear evidence of systematic failure. Morrison's journey from racist cop to prison minister demonstrated that even the most damaged souls could find redemption through genuine accountability and sustained service to others, while Devon's evolution from traumatized veteran to national leader showed how individual healing and social justice could reinforce each other through courage, restraint, and an unshakable commitment to constitutional principles. The legacy lived on in every officer trained at the center, every corrupt official prosecuted under reforms bearing Devon's name, and every community that chose accountability over cover-up, healing over hatred, and justice over revenge. From a single confrontation in a rural courthouse to a movement that transformed American policing, the story reminded the world that change was possible, that truth was stronger than power, and that sometimes the most profound victories came not from fighting back, but from showing restraint when violence seemed justified, mercy when punishment was expected, and hope when cynicism felt safer. If you found this story of justice redemption and the power of restraint inspiring, please like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about how small acts of courage can create massive change, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Together, we can continue building bridges of understanding one story at a time.